Chapter 619. Silence. It was a long silence. Huaishi's face twitched. He raised his phone and asked, "I think I understand a little, but did you steal the settings of some manga?" Shinichi looked away guiltily. "It's easier to understand. Anyway, that's about it." Huaishi thought for a moment and raised his phone again. "Are you crazy?" No. Shinichi sounded even more guilty this time. In short, it said that in order to avoid a repeat of the bloodshed between the Wu family and the Gong family decades ago, His Majesty has once again issued an order of mercy on living creatures. All officials are not allowed to kill. If not for this, they wouldn't dare to go out. Shinichi's expression suddenly became gloomy. "But I didn't expect that I would still be targeted. It would be strange if I wasn't targeted, right? Even if the conflict between the officials was restricted and the proxy war was used to determine the winner, it only prevented large-scale conflicts on the surface. All conflicts would be hidden in the dark. They would be solved in a crueler and colder way. At the same time, as long as they were not discovered, many people would start to act more crazily. Now that the position of the head of the Rigian family was vacant, many people were staring at it. To be able to survive all the way to the capital and come to Nara on the Shinkansen line before encountering an assassin was already a great stroke of luck. But when he thought about the proxy war between the chef and the demon, Huaishi was shocked to find that he had become a tool again. But it didn't seem to be anything to be scared of. He was used to it. What did the bloody conflict in Ingzhou have to do with him? Miss Huaishiki was just a cold and heartless cooking machine. Just when Huaishi was calmly drinking tea, Shinichi Rigian blinked and came over to him. She looked at him and said, "Miss Huaishiki, you're also an ascender, right?" Huaishi didn't even want to answer. "Why don't you come with me to the Rigian family?" Shinichi Rigian grabbed his hand and didn't mind that the cup was hot. The Rigian family must be short of people now. A powerful ascender like you can definitely make a lot of money. "I say, Miss Shinichi, I'm just an unknown ascender. Is it really okay for you to invite a wolf into your house? Besides, I've already been hired by your cousin. He was a person with ulterior motives. You're leading the way so smoothly that it's making me a little nervous." Looking at Huaishi's silent appearance, her expression gradually dimmed. "Can't I?" "I don't care." Huaishi sighed and raised his phone to tell her. In any case, they would have to deal with each other in the future. He might as well go in and take a look at the situation. While he was at it, he might as well eliminate this silly road deer in front of him. The sooner he eliminated it, the better. It would be best if he didn't even have the slightest chance of being selected. Miracles attract each other. Similarly, calamities would also occur. For ordinary people, the further away they were from the ascendants, the safer they would be. This was because the higher the level of the stigmata, the greater the distortion it would cause to the surroundings. Don't you see a bunch of Tier 4 and Tier 5 monsters roaming the borders in hell? In a modern realm, once you leave your own area, you would be heavily monitored by the Astronomy Society. It would be like a criminal wearing ankle bracelets. Anyone would feel uncomfortable. Picking up a lousy book had caused his life to deviate so much. As an ordinary person, the deeper Rikumi Maki entered the world of the Ascendants, the more unfortunate her fate would be. She didn't even have a soul, so she might inexplicably go crazy when she saw something. The sooner she left the group, the sooner she would be safe. A certain someone who had already turned into a traitor before nodding his head made up his mind. "Ah, that's great." Not knowing what Huaishi was planning, Rikumi Maki jumped up excitedly, almost dancing with joy. Occasionally, she would look at the big sister next to her, unable to hide the joy in her heart. "Great. I could spend some time with Miss Kaisha again." "Maki, come on, fight. First, set a small goal. Get Miss Kaishi's contact information. Let's become good friends. In short, mother far away in my hometown, please bless me. I seem to have fallen in love with a woman." The happy time alone didn't last long. Soon, the silent street was illuminated by car lights. The drowsy waiter woke up, looked at the lights outside the window, and was stunned. The dozen or so expensive luxury cars were parked in front of the fast food restaurant. From the middle of the limousine, a solemn and cold figure walked out. Looking straight ahead, he walked into the restaurant and slowly looked around. The chill spread. The waiter stiffened, gathered his courage, and asked with a trembling voice, "Customer, do you need anything?" The person didn't respond. His eyes fell on the corner of the restaurant, the girl who was chattering to the indifferent traveling companion. At the same time, the indifferent traveling companion finally raised his face and looked over. Even with the person's composure, he couldn't help but be stunned in front of that face for a moment. At the same time, what appeared was not admiration of beauty, but deep fear. And Huaisher was also looking at him. There was a black eye patch over his left eye. The middle-aged man was wearing a long robe from Yingzhou, which was not suitable for the current era. He didn't have a sword, and he was barehanded. But the hands exposed from his sleeves were covered with scars and calluses. It made people think of a sharp and heavy weapon. His expression was cold, but She seemed to be unaware of this. She rushed forward with great trust and hugged the man's arm. "Uncle Yinjing, you came to pick me up. You've had a hard journey, Miss Shi." Yinjing's mouth slightly raised a smile, and finally there was an expression. But soon, he walked to Huaisher. "I'm Yinjing from Jiao Village. Yinjing from Jiao Village." The middle-aged man bowed and thanked him seriously. "I've heard the details. Thank you for saving Miss Shi." It seemed that in just a few minutes, he figured out what happened. He invited, "It's late now. If you don't mind, please rest in my house for a night. That way, we can express our gratitude." Huaisher nodded and got up. When they brushed past each other, he raised his eyebrows slightly. There was a bloody smell on this man, the smell of fresh death. Although the Rigian family's territory was in the Kotoima area, it didn't extend to today's Nara. But in the center of this area where the noble families gathered, there were still many industries. The convoy drove all the way out and took them directly to a Yingzhou-style manor outside the city to settle down. Along the way, She shouted like a village girl and even took photos with her mobile phone. She couldn't hide the smell of the countryside at all. Even the servants next to her couldn't help but snicker. On the contrary, when facing Miss Huaisher, they felt a headache and trembled with fear. It was probably because she seemed to be expressionless all the time. She was never surprised by everything in front of her, nor did she have any admiration, let alone envy. Even when looking at the landscape of the courtyard that was designed and maintained by the famous chef, and when the famous chef served dinner, she didn't show any emotion. On the contrary, she was emitting a kind of pressure all the time. There was a faint trace of disappointment in his voice. "That's it? Brother, are you kidding me?" Yinjing Jiaoshan accompanied her the whole time and secretly observed her, but found that this coldness was not fake at all. On the contrary, when dinner was over, he called the musician who was performing in the hall and wanted to hear the old man's impression of her, but he heard an unexpected answer from the other party. "That lady should be a noble with a high status, right?" The old musician thought for a moment and answered seriously, "With so many years of experience serving guests, I can't help but feel afraid. Even when I played for the emperor's emissaries and the noble officials, I didn't feel such pressure." Yinjing Jiaoshan was silent. After a long time, he nodded and waved his hand to signal him to leave. Then he got up and walked to the small building at the back of the manor. After passing through many verifications, the final paper door opened in front of him. Behind the door, the room was dimly lit, illuminating the retainers sitting around the long table. Sitting at the head of the table was the retainer, Inu Jiang, who was now fully in charge of the affairs of the Rigian family. When he saw Yinjing Jiaoshan enter, he waved his hand and motioned for him to sit. "Sorry for making you wait. I'm late." Yinjing Jiaoshan sat down and said, "I just brought Miss Shi back. Something happened." "Qing Ping's daughter?" Yinjing Jiaoshan nodded. "Is the problem serious?" Inu Jiang frowned. "I remember that Qing Ping only has one daughter. Nothing happened, right? It has been settled by someone." Yinjing Jiaoshan got up, took a step back, and then knelt down again. He sat down and asked for forgiveness. "It is my responsibility to leak the news of Miss Shi." "Forget it. Who doesn't want to sit in the position of the head of the family? Even if it is the weakest competitor, if you can get rid of them, you must act decisively. Hey, that group of kids back then, one by one, they have become like this." Inu Jiang shook his head coldly. It was hard to tell whether it was praise or disdain. As for Zhun Shi, he just sighed in pity. She must be scared. If it wasn't for the looming hall ordering us to gather all the bloodlines, how could she be involved in this? With the blood of the Wu family, being weak is the original sin. He had seen too many similar tragedies. After understanding the situation, Inu Jiang asked, "That woman called Huai Ji, have you found out the details?" "Not yet. It is said that she is a student of the Ivory Tower, but I always feel that there is something wrong, and it doesn't seem like a chance encounter." Whether it is a chance encounter or an ulterior motive, since she came to Rigian House, she is a guest of Rigian House. Don't let others laugh at Rigian House for having no etiquette. Inu Jiang pondered for a moment and said, "Treat her well, then give her a generous gift and send her away. Now is an eventful time. It is not convenient for her to stay for long." In the silence, someone suddenly asked, "What if she doesn't leave?" Inu Jiang did not answer. What else did he need to answer? If he couldn't drive her away, she would be an evil guest. This topic ended here. Next was the urgent matter that needed to be solved before the heirs arrived. "Jiaoshan, how is the investigation of the murderous demon?" Chapter 620. Since half a month ago, there had been a series of murders in Nara City. Every night, a decapitated corpse would appear on the streets. For half a month, there was not a single day of interruption. There were rich traces of Origin's substance left at the scene. Without a doubt, it was done by an ascendant. Including today, 16 people's heads had been chopped off. The identities of the dead were irregular. There were ordinary office workers, ascendants, and even an attendant of a minister, but the ending was undoubtedly the same. Their necks were cut off by the same mistake. They gave death cleanly and then turned around and left without any reluctance, not leaving any clues for the pursuers. They mysteriously melted into the night. Only a tragic scene and full of ridicule was left. Horn Mountain lowered his head in shame. "I'm incompetent. I'm a step late again." He was so close to catching that guy's tracks. "Continue to investigate," Inu Jiang said. "Now that such a big mess has happened in the city before the start of the Imperial Chef Demon Duel, I'm afraid that the looming hall will use this as a pretext to make a fuss and say that we have failed in our duty." A disdainful sneer came from below. Wasn't this sent by them? Inu Jiang raised his eyes and looked over. "Jiu Lang, am I wrong, Mr. Inu Jiang?" The young man whispered angrily. "They single-handedly forced the death of the uncle who begged for his life for the Riken family back then. And now they're hypocritically accusing us of failing in our duty? They want to accuse us. Jiu Lang." Inu Jiang raised his voice and raised his old eyes. He warned word by word. "This is not something you can interrupt." The young man stubbornly raised his head and asked, "Am I not a warrior of the Riken family? If it was 200 years ago, a warrior of the Riken family would have been ordered to commit seppuku if he dared to say such ungrateful words here." Inu Jiang coldly retorted, "You're not the master yet. Wait until you sit in that position, then think about how to give orders to us old men. Now, before I get angry, go back to your room. This is not a place for you to behave atrociously." Jiulang's face flushed red. Soon, he lowered his head and left. The door closed. Beside Quan Jiang, the old warrior sighed. Jiulang died in grief. He was still young and had no intention of offending you. Who doesn't know? Quan Jiang shook his head and sighed. Otherwise, if it was someone with ulterior motives, I would have cut off his head in front of all of you. Jiulang, Lijian Jingjiang, was the nephew of the previous generation's Lijian Buer. Rigian Fuji didn't have any children of his own. Since Jiulang was young, Rigian Fuji treated him as his own child. And after the previous generation's master was demoted and died of shame, the one who suffered the most was undoubtedly him. Now that the young people had said such rude words, the old people could understand, but they couldn't indulge them. Driving him away was already the greatest protection he could offer. The meeting must continue. After settling the remaining trivial matters, Quan Jiang tiredly raised his hand to rub the bridge of his nose. He closed his eyes and sighed. Picking up a towel, he casually wiped his face and forced himself to stay alert. He was already old, 164 years old. He had almost witnessed the recent history of the Rygian family. From an unknown warrior, he gradually became Quan Jiang, who inherited the name of the 8 dogs of Rygian. It could be said that in addition to being the master, this old man was the real backbone of the Rygian family. And Quan Jiang had always been trusted by the previous masters because of his restraint of power and loyalty to the family. The generations that grew up after experiencing the age of turmoil, no matter how ambitious they were, understood how important the existence of the family was. Only by being closely united and seeking survival together could they survive in the increasingly dangerous situation. Unfortunately, the young people today didn't think like that. Since the previous generation, the struggle had been out of control. Now, as the general gradually took over the emperor, everyone in the entire Yingzhou was swaying in the huge political vortex. It was difficult for them to control themselves. No, it should be said that the moment the country's door was opened by the Black Ship of Rome, the era had changed. After resting for a moment, he forced himself to stay alert and looked at the 7 people around him. The 8 dogs of Rygian. Now, the 8 retainers of the Rygian family who held different rights. After losing the master, the 8 people who could represent the Rygian family were all here. After a few days, I believe everyone already has a list in their hearts, right? In the silence, the warriors who were no longer young slowly nodded and shared the information they had investigated. In the end, they might become the next master. At the front, needless to say, was the adopted son of the previous master, Jiu Lang, Rygian Jiujing. Then, it was the younger brother of the previous master, Rygian Jiu, who had hurriedly returned from America. The person in charge of Rygian Jiaguanshan Group, Rygian Jiujing. Rygian Zhongping from the Russian Federation. In the end, the last son of the Rygian family, Rygian Hupe. It's ridiculous. During the banquet, an elder roared angrily, the daughter of a sinner who betrayed Yingzhou and was exiled to Dongxia. The looming hall actually recognized her talent? A bunch of idiots. What on earth are those guys thinking? Quan Jiang raised his eyes and said calmly, Hupo's father is also someone who sacrificed for the family. In my opinion, she's no different from the other juniors. They're all children of the Rygian family. Mr. Quan Jiang, don't you understand why she's here? Could it be that her purpose is different from the other people's? Quan Jiang raised his voice and asked back. He looked around solemnly. Since she's the blood of the Rygian family, she's qualified to inherit the position of the master of the Rygian family. Everyone, don't lose your duty. Everyone lowered their eyes respectfully and no longer objected. In the silence, Quan Jiang suddenly couldn't help but sneered himself. He was the one who exiled Hupa back then. At this moment, the others probably scolded him for being old and confused, right? But at the same time, in his eyes, there was no difference between Rygian Hupa and the other juniors. As for why the looming hall would recognize her bloodline and an exiled person in the Social Security Bureau, he could roughly understand the consideration behind it. There was no other reason. It was simply the balance of 2 evils. It wasn't because of some noble and pitiful reason to give a sinner a chance to prove themselves and atone for their sins. It wasn't because they believed that Hupa would emerge from the mud without being stained. It was purely because she reaped what she sowed. The result of having no power outside and gradually losing control inside. Denying the blood of the Chinese and rejecting the infiltration of the Dongxia lineage, which result was more serious. No matter what Rygian Hupa did, there was no doubt that she had the direct bloodline of the master of the Rygian family. At the same time, she was the Orthodox Chinese. As for the possibility of colluding with external powers, were there few people who colluded with external powers? Each and every one of them was like a wanderer waiting for a good price. It was despicable. And now, among the successors of the Rygian family, who knew how much sand had been mixed in, who knew how many people had already chosen a side for themselves, General, His Majesty, various ministers, and even others in a mess. When they chose the cooking demon to represent them in the duel, they themselves had already become the representatives of others. But what does this have to do with us old people? Quan Jiang lowered his eyes and lowered his head to look at the bland tea in the cup, shaking his head mockingly. You say it as if the Rigian family can still decide on their own. He made it sound as if the real House of Insight could still exist after this turmoil. He closed his eyes. He sighed tiredly. The next day, noon, in the Ingzhou-style banquet hall, there was complete silence. It was clearly the most lively time for lunch, but the people sitting behind each seat were expressionless. Those old people were eating in silence, and when the young people looked at each other, their eyes seemed to be able to produce sparks. It was clearly a banquet meticulously prepared by a famous chef, but it was tasteless. Only a country bumpkin was still wolfing down his food and surfing Twitter mindlessly. He was so amused by the funny artist that he burst into laughter. After eating, he wiped his mouth and slowly moved to the side of the beauty next to him like a hamster. He tugged at her sleeve. Miss YG, Miss YG, I heard there's a hot spring behind. She blinked her big, curious eyes. After lunch, let's go to the hot spring together. Under the strange eyes of the others, Huaisher couldn't help but want to sigh. Miss Shi, is Ning as stupid as the Rigian family? No. Why can't you learn to read the air that you Ingzhou people are so proud of? Let me take a good look at the atmosphere. Hot spring? If I were a competitor, I would have used up all the hot spring water and replaced it with sulfuric acid. Although he was complaining about Shi's carelessness in his heart, he still maintained a dignified look on the surface. He ate his meal slowly, his posture was elegant, and his movements were graceful. No matter how harsh the standard was to judge, it was impossible to find any flaw in that pleasing posture. Today's Miss YG was still perfect. She was only wearing the guest bathrobe sent by the attendants, but it was as if she was wearing a gorgeous Tang suit, constantly exuding an indescribable charm to the surroundings. The iconic cowherd business smile that he learned from old Liu was changed here. The green was better than the master, forming a smile that made it difficult for people to look away, especially when he looked at the end of the table at a certain stinky sister that he hadn't seen for a long time. It made him even happier. Thinking up to this point, he secretly took out his phone and sent an email over with a wicked sense of humor. Dear Hupo, I'm here. In the crowd, under the cold, hostile gazes of many blood relatives, Hupo was still eating calmly when he noticed the vibration of his phone on the table. He looked down, then his eyeballs almost fell out. The hand that was holding the rice trembled. Where the hell are you? You're home. Your bed is so big and comfortable. Hupa felt like he was upside down. He couldn't understand what was happening at all. What kind of stupid thing was this guy saying? Am I behind the times? What kind of joke is this? Are you going to stop being a cowherd and talk about Luoyu? No, this is the truth. I arrived 3 days early, and then your family invited me over. They treated me well with good food and drinks, warm and hospitable, much better than the cold treatment of a poor little girl. Are you jealous? Are you King kidding me? She typed a greeting without hesitation, but before she could finish, she froze for a moment and realized that something was wrong. The atmosphere around them changed. Just as she and Huaisher were focused on connecting the lines, the gazes around them gradually became strange. Astonishment, confusion, shock, confusion, and greed. No, they weren't looking at her, but behind her. She frowned and finally heard a soft breathing behind her. She turned around abruptly and saw a face that was inches away. A pair of big, watery eyes, flirtatious and pure, like a white lotus that bloomed in green tea. Wearing a green bathrobe, the woman who had arrived at some point in time knelt behind Upa. Her long hair was tied into a ponytail that fell over her left shoulder. She raised her hand and tucked her hair behind her ear. Her smile was gentle. But for Hupa, the horror came suddenly, accompanied by the horror of the past and the memories of despair that rose in her heart. She was so frightened that she almost jumped on the spot, wanting to draw her sword. Luo Xian. No, this is at that moment. Under everyone's gaze, Miss Huaisher bent down slightly and intimately leaned close to her ear, greeting her with a deep voice that she hadn't heard in a long time. Are you stupid, stupid sister? Chapter 621. One day, under the cold and hostile gazes of her family members, in a family that she was already unfamiliar with, Hoopa suddenly met a stunning beauty that she had never seen before. Then, this beauty walked towards her with a smile that was thick with shadows. Beside her ear, she used an extremely familiar and annoying voice to say, "Are you dumbfounded, stinky sister?" It was as if she had been punched in the chin. Even Hoopa couldn't help but feel her vision go black. She was utterly defeated in front of this overly fantastical reality. She was dumbfounded. What the hell? She felt like she was going to split open. Similarly, little True Hope felt like she was going to split open. Right in front of her, at the other end of the long table, the person she had a crush on and her cousin whom she hadn't seen for many years were leaning against each other. They were so intimate, chatting and laughing, and even seemed to be talking. So happy, so familiar. As if they were a match made in heaven. And she was just a stinky brother who didn't even have the chance to be a third party. She curled up in the corner and couldn't help but want to wipe her tears. So petty. Then, in front of everyone's eyes, the two girls who were warm and harmonious with each other smiled and whispered to each other. They could no longer hide each other's evil natures. "Stinky brother, you've done it. You've finally gone to Thailand? Crawl, this is called killing both men and women." Huaishir lowered his face and whispered in her ear, "Stinky sister, are you jealous?" There was a soft smack. Under the table, under the sleeves of the bathrobe, two palms had already collided. The 5 fingers were separated, the fingertips were intertwined, and the palms were pressed together. Under the seemingly intimate posture, the muscles under the bathrobe were flowing like water. In the silence, bursts of increasingly strong power erupted. Like arm wrestling, tightly clenched together. In the silence, thunder clashed. It was as if she couldn't wait to crush the other person to death here. Out of Huaishir's expectations, his palm was actually blocked. It was as if she had a thorough understanding of all his skills and understood all the changes in his movements. In close proximity, Hoopa's beautiful face was filled with a mocking smile. "Drummer, don't forget that I entered the orchard earlier than you, little brother." Smack! Before she finished speaking, her shoulder suddenly shook and her joints rubbed against each other. An enormous power erupted in an instant, destroying her control and counterattack. She regained control of the situation. He pinned her wrist to the ground. "That's it. That's it. That's all." Huaishir chuckled. "Then wouldn't I have to clean up the sect on behalf of the founder today?" Oh. Although she said that, she didn't tear apart the disguise of intimacy between the two of them. Instead, she took the initiative to let go of her hand. After all, he wasn't a demon. How could he do anything to the pitiful little Amber in public? In the past few years, Hoopa's teamwork had improved at an incredible speed. Huaishir was afraid that if this continued, he would fail. After all, his specialty wasn't in the field of hand-to-hand combat. If he really had a dagger, he would have killed his stinky sister in 2 rounds. How would he give her the chance to be arrogant? "All right, if you think you can do it, let's have a try." Hoopa spoke into Huaishir's ear in Dongsha language with a strong regional accent. "Don't leave after eating if you dare." The fight was over. Miss Huaiji, who had won, snorted in disdain. She got up with a smile and left, leaving the loser behind to return her seat. Then, she noticed that she was still petrified. She didn't know what had happened. "Are you sick?" No, I'm not." She seemed to be shocked. She hurriedly shook her head and looked at Miss Huaiji beside her. Then, she looked at her cousin, Hoopa, who she hadn't seen for a long time. Her gaze moved back and forth. After a long time, she gathered her courage and asked, "Miss Huaiji, you can talk, right?" Huaishir wanted to roll his eyes. "So, is that what you're paying attention to? Shouldn't you be suspecting that there's something going on between me and Hoopa? Shouldn't you feel that you no longer trust me? How can I only talk? I can also sing, dance, play the piano, and play the cello. None of those are things that you can handle." He thought for a moment and replied on his phone, "If I say something to you, you might not be able to handle it." She was confused. It was hard to understand. She didn't understand why she wouldn't be able to handle it. But when she remembered that Miss Huaiji was a sublimator and she seemed to be one of the stronger sublimators. She suddenly seemed to understand. I understand now. Could this be the silent meditation that her father once talked about? Through the cultivation of not listening, not seeing, not speaking, and not moving, what kind of secret method could one achieve? Just by speaking to a normal person, that person's worldview would shatter, their soul would be impacted, and they would spit out blood and die? That sounds amazing. She gave a thumbs up and praised in admiration. As expected of Miss Huaiji, Huaisha was speechless. Although he didn't know what she understood, he decided to let her be. After thinking for a while, he wrote on his phone again. Also, I have something to do in the afternoon, so I won't be going to the hot springs. She was stunned for a moment. Her originally expectant expression dimmed. If it was Huaisha, you would say, "Don't write everything on your face. Your expression is too easy to understand." He sighed and continued writing. "Don't just think about having fun. Come with me." And then, "Okay, I'm always free." In an instant, Zhanshi's spirit was lifted. Her eyes lit up, and she nodded vigorously. There seemed to be an invisible little tail wagging crazily behind her back. What's wrong with this woman? Huaisha sighed. He suddenly felt a headache coming on. Why is it that the people who meet here are all so strange? In the afternoon, in the manor's overly spacious courtyard, Huaisha finally found an opportunity to officially meet his employer under the shade of a tree. Although the two of them still exchanged a few words, as usual, the topic eventually came back to work. "But why did you bring her along?" Hu Po's expression was indescribable as he looked behind Huaisha in the distance. In the corner of the courtyard, there was a little girl who was excitedly squatting in front of the fish pond and playing with goldfish. "We'll talk about her later. Let's talk about you first." Huaisha sighed. The cage of dreams in his hand shook a little. Wisps of faint mist spread out and set up a layer of the simplest illusion to slightly conceal the environment inside. Although he wasn't very proficient in the dream world, he was still able to slightly modify the scene. In the eyes of others, the two of them were just talking under the shade of a tree. Huaisha had already sat down on the ground. He lifted the hem of his bathrobe and scratched the itch on his calf. Then, he took out a cigarette from his pocket and lit it. Finally, he didn't have to worry about disguising himself anymore. "Tell me, what's going on with your family? It's like there's a problem with each family." Speaking of this, Koopa was no longer in the mood to mock Huaisha. His expression became disdainful. What else could it be? It's a problem left behind by history. The sins of the ancestors of the past few generations can only be repaid by the descendants. Since 200 years ago, the Rigian family was famous for not taking sides. They relied on their special status and power to please both sides. They didn't want to offend either side. When others were fighting until their heads bled, they would just watch from the side. However, in the eyes of both sides, the bastards of the Rigian family were traitors who repeatedly jumped between the Wu family and the Gong family. They saw it and hated it in their hearts. They wrote it down on paper and made a list long ago, a few decades ago, when the Rigian family began to repeatedly jump between the two sides again. They found that they jumped in the wrong place this time. The general who was exiled from America didn't care what the Rigian family was. Traitors had to die. In order to protect the family, the head of the previous generation had no choice but to offer his head as an apology. And now, the head of the previous generation was hated by the emperor because he was close to the general. The life of the Rigian family was too bumpy and complicated. Due to various reasons, they had fallen to their current state. They had become an empty shell. Just by looking at the candidates for the head of the family, you can tell that the Rigian family is hopeless. Koopa sneered. Other than the emperor and the general exerting their influence, Rome, America, Russia, Dongxia. Except for the Indians who don't have much initiative and the Egyptians who like to be autistic, almost all the other major families have a hand in it. The strongest competitor, the adopted son of the previous generation's head, Jiulang, Rigian Jingjiang. Oh no, I have to call him Jiu Jing now. After my second uncle died, he changed his name. Now, he has fully sided with the general. The supporter behind him is the American capital that has long been drooling over the Rigian family's cans import. Honest man shipping. Huaisha raised his eyebrows. Just like how Honest Monk wasn't honest at all, Honest Man Shipping wasn't an honest man either. If they were really kind and honest, they wouldn't be a giant trust company that controlled more than 40% of the border and logistics. At the same time, the elders in the family had already taken his side when they saw injustice. The current Jiujing could be said to be the most legitimate and most popular successor to the head of the family. And the head of the Rigian family's Kanzan group, Rigian Bujing, who controlled the family's internal financial power, secretly colluded with the looming mansion. At the same time, he had dealings with Rome's Minerva technology. The big brother Rigian Jinping, who interrupted his study in the Russian Federation and hurriedly returned, supported by the Russian Federation's Constantine Trading Group, in Hu Po's concise introduction. Huaishir quickly straightened out the complicated situation in the Rigian family. It was like layers of matryoshka dolls. The agent companies that had deep relationships with the major families chose their agents in Yingzhou, and then the agents of the agents found their helpers to fight the agent war for them. It was really King enough. It's time to ban matryoshka dolls. Huaishir pinched the cigarette and looked up at her. Then what about you? Suanio can't let you come empty-handed, right? Hoopa glanced at him and didn't hide it. She answered directly. Taiching Heavy Industries. Chapter 622. It really was a meeting of the gods. Taiching Heavy Industries. It was a famous military cooperation enterprise in Dongxia. It was a giant heavy industry group created by the previous generation's master, Lu Wu. It was a huge capital consortium that spanned across the present world, the border, and hell. Huaishir's expression twitched. He suddenly slapped his bare knee and said in a trembling voice, "Old Tai, this is not easy to handle. You have to pay more." "That's not easy to handle." Hoopa glanced at him and snorted. "There's something even more difficult to handle. I can't believe it. What did you do, you bastard?" She glared at Huaishir with resentment. Finally, she looked at the back of a person who was happily playing with goldfish by the pond. She let out a long sigh. She had nothing left to lose. "Forget it. Since you've gained her trust, then you could be Zhanshi's agent," she said. "I'm afraid she doesn't trust anyone here other than you." Huaishir's smile disappeared and gradually turned cold. "I refuse. Don't worry. I'll give you the money and remuneration." "I know what you're thinking, Hoopa, but you better save it," Huaishir said coldly. "She's just an ordinary person. You can't push her into this fire pit." "Huaishir, from the moment you saved her, she was already destined to be a thorn in other people's side. At least she's not mine. She shouldn't be yours either. She's your blood relative, Hoopa. She can't be the head of the family and can't even be your competitor. It's too easy to kill her," Hoopa retorted. "It's not easy for her to stay alive." Huaishir frowned. "What do you mean?" Hoopa didn't say anything. It was as if she suddenly realized that she had made a mistake. She looked at Huaishir and was stunned, as if she couldn't believe it. "So you really didn't do anything, Huaishir?" She didn't know if that expression was of admiration or change of opinion. It was very unbelievable. She leaned closer and asked seriously, "You guys didn't sleep? Stinky sister, don't treat me as a sex maniac." Huaishir was furious. "All right, let's not talk about the gossip outside. For the time being, we'll just assume that you're an upright person." Hoopa sighed. "If you've taken off her clothes, you'll know." "Huaishir, she's a mixed breed." Huaishir's movements suddenly became sluggish. "Bastard?" He thought for a long time before he remembered that this was the name given to those with beastly characteristics. Part of the mutation phenomenon would only appear in newborns at the border that was too deep, but how could this have anything to do with a country girl like Xinshi? "She didn't tell you, did she?" Hoopa smoked irritably and said in a muffled voice, "I'm afraid that only Jiaoshan knows about this. After all, it's a family scandal. Her father, my Uncle Qing Ping, was infected by the abyss. She was unlucky and won a prize. It was a passive inheritance, and she was sent to a remote border area from the moment she was born. If it wasn't for the patriarch's election, I'm afraid she wouldn't have been able to come out from there. This is her only chance, Huaishir. Have you seen how most mixed breeds live?" Hoopa lowered his head and said softly, "They aren't protected by the three great mysteries and have to endure the corrosion of the abyss in their bodies at all times. If they can't become a sublimator, then they'll die at the age of 50, 40, or even earlier because their origin form will collapse. But most people aren't that lucky. Before that, all kinds of complications will begin to torment them. Spondylitis, diabetes, lupus erythematosus, rheumatism. Starting from the immune system, they'll be tormented. In the end, if they don't want to be dehydrated, they'll have to calculate every single grain of salt they eat 3 times. Most people can't take this kind of torture and commit suicide. How old is Junshi now? Huaisher thought for a moment and said 17. It'll be soon. Hoopa sighed softly. Once puberty ended, the pathological period would begin. From then on, it would be a long and painful downhill slope all the way to hell. She doesn't have any other choice, Huaisher. Hoopa shook his head. She didn't come here for the free 10-day tour of the capital. No matter how stupid a person is, they know how dangerous this is. But if she wants a way out, she'll have to risk her life. Otherwise, the only thing that awaits her is a tragic death at the age of 30 or 40, just like that uncle of mine. If you ask me, that bastard shouldn't have had children in the first place. Hoop has stamped out the cigarette, but with his foot, his expression dark. It's fine if you're the only one suffering, but why do you have to implicate the next generation? In the silence, Huaisher suddenly said, I can send her to the ivory tower. Hoopa sneered. Like raising a pet? It's not easy to live in a sterile room. Huaisher. Just as she was about to mock him, Huaisher raised his head and looked at her. His sharp senses picked up on what she didn't say. Is there a way for her to live? Hoopo's expression stiffened. It was hard for her to understand from the bottom of her heart why this bastard sense of smell would be unreasonably sharp every time it involved a beautiful woman. After a long silence, she finally chose to tell him the family secret. Have you heard of the legend of the 8 dogs in the South? Huaisher shook his head decisively. What's that? Hoopa couldn't help but roll her eyes. With your level of education, how did you become a teacher in the ivory tower? To put it simply, it's the legend of the Rygian family's ancestors. It's said that at the most dangerous moment of the Rygian family, a miracle called Yatsufusa descended from the sky and turned into a dog. It blessed 8 warriors and helped the head of the Rygian family to successfully restore the country. She said, although most of it is just a rumor, the Yatsufusa itself is real. This was the true treasure of the Rygian family. The most precious secret treasure, the stigmata relic, the glazed armor of Faketzel, Yatsufusa. In addition to inheriting the power of the stigmata of the 12 pharmacists, divine generals, it also had the indestructible defense of the Vajra region. Other than the indestructible glazed sword, it was also the guarantee that the family could continue to pass down the family's legacy. Without relying on the quota of the Astronomy Association, every 100 years, 8 people would be able to become ascendants without any repercussions. After explaining the full effects of the family's treasure, Hoopa promised, Huaisher, as long as I become the head, she will be the next generation of Yatsufusa warrior. Only by becoming an ascendant can the abyss erosion on her body be neutralized without any repercussions. This is the best way. Other than that, Huaisher asked directly, you're the one who will gain more, right? Yes. Hoopa nodded. To control the Rygian family, I need someone with a clean background, someone who could be trusted to bear part of the responsibility for me. Is there anyone more suitable than Makoto? Huaisher shook his head. Are you so sure that she will cooperate with you? If she is so easily controlled, why won't she be affected by others? You're the one who brought her to me, aren't you? Hoopa laughed softly. Mystic Bird is right. The greatest opportunity lies with the first person to arrive. In fact, the original plan was not like this, but there was a prerequisite to consider who would appear in front of me first. According to Mystic Bird's suggestion, if it was the original, the final result would either be great fortune or great misfortune. There were no other options. But if it was you, the Rygian family would still have a chance to be saved. I finally understand what he meant. Mystic Bird, a suggestion from the king of the pedigree, one could understand the weight of it, especially for someone like Mystic Bird, who became more and more sinister as he got older. He was a person who calculated 10 steps ahead of him. and could make a 1,000-layer pancake when others went up a level. Huaisher could not find any reason to refute him. If it were anyone else, Huaisher might be afraid and jump over the wall to escape, afraid that he would be used as cannon fodder. But Mystic Bird was too lazy to play this game. That old man was extremely cautious. His style was so stable that there were no loopholes or shortcomings. His divination skills were even more frightening. Between a sure profit and no loss, he could firmly occupy the latter and maintain a relatively small profit. Only he would never take any big risks. As a tool of the Dongsha pedigree, at least his safety was guaranteed. There was no such thing as being unlucky and suddenly dying on the road. But the problem was, what does he want to do? Huaisher asked. I don't know. Hoopa shrugged. But it definitely has nothing to do with the Astronomy Society or the Ivory Tower. It won't affect you at all. Or do you think this is Mystic Bird's scheme? As she spoke, she could not help but glance in the direction of the capital. Her tone became somewhat mocking. For this kind of thing, there's no such thing as a one-sided passion. Huaisher sighed. You're willing to be a puppet? Don't make it sound so bad. I'm just a tool. Hoopa waved her hand indifferently. Isn't this what a warrior is like? What's the difference between being a tool of the emperor and a general and being a tool of the Dongsha pedigree? Moreover, she suddenly opened her mouth and asked, if the Continuation Institute now sets Xinhai as a lockdown area, what will you do, Huaisher? Refuse to carry it out? Huaisher was silent. He had no answer. If the situation was serious enough to require the Continuation Institute to lock down the area, he was afraid there was no room for him to refuse. Isn't that right? The hairtail distributed by the Social Security Bureau every year is not that easy to eat, Huaisher. Hoopa crumpled the empty 7-star box into a ball and casually threw it into the trash can at the other end of the courtyard. She clapped her hands and looked at Jin Shi, who was beside the pond. Zhan Shi noticed their gazes and also looked over. In her hand was a plastic bag holding a goldfish that she had fished out from her pond. She was excitedly waving at Huaisher to show off the fruits of her labor. Hearing Huaisher's pained sigh, this time it was Hoopa's turn to gloat. Go and have a good discussion with your next employer. Hoopa patted him on the shoulder and turned to leave. I'll leave the matters of life and death to you, Mr. Tool. A real beautiful girl just needs to sit there and wait for someone to deliver the fruits of her labor. Little Hoopa snorted happily and turned to leave. Did you see that, stinky little brother? This is the joy and victory of a rich woman. Chapter 6:23. Miss Heike-san? Sitting on a chair by the pond, Shinichi looked at her companion worriedly, unable to hide her uneasiness. She didn't know what she said to her cousin, but she fell silent after returning. She was expressionless, but her eyes became a little scary. No, it should be said that it just made Shinichi feel scared. It wasn't fierce, nor was it gloomy. It was calm as usual, but different from before. They became so far away, like the mirage and rainbow light floating on the horizon. It made people feel that they couldn't touch it even if they spent their whole lives. Huaisher's thoughts were interrupted. He sighed and raised his phone. Shinichi, do you want to join the competition? Zhan, she stood rooted to the ground, stunned. It was as if her lie had been exposed. She was at a loss and wanted to run away. Being stared at by those eyes, the habitual smile on her face gradually disappeared. She lowered her head uneasily. I haven't thought about it yet. I don't want to use Miss Heike-san. I'm sorry, I wanted to say it earlier, but I can't think of anything to pay for it. I'm sorry. When he said this, his tone became hurried, as if he was afraid that she wouldn't believe him. He looked at her and explained in a panic. Only this, please believe me. I've never thought of using you. She couldn't finish her sentence. She lowered her head. Huaisher shook his head and handed over his phone. Have you considered hiring me? The girl was stunned. Unbelievable. She looked down at her phone, then looked up at him, then looked away in panic. The fingers behind her back were twisting uneasily. But I don't have money. No, of course I don't mean to ask Miss Heike-san to do anything for free. I mean, can I give you an IOU? No matter how much it costs, I'll pay you back in the future. Then The courage and confidence she had just mustered was shattered in front of the new number on the phone. 70 million US dollars. Shinichi froze on the spot. 70 million? USD? So much. Even if it was 70 million US dollars, she didn't dare to dream of such a thing. He worked in a convenience store, and his hourly wage was 800 yuan. However, he only worked for 4 hours a day and 4 days a week. If he worked part-time at the ramen shop, he would earn 640 per hour for the night shift. However, the head chef was a good person and gave him an extra commission. If he were to live frugally every month, he would be able to save about 30,000 yen. After graduating from university, he would look for a job. Then, in an instant, countless numbers flashed through his mind. In the end, he came to a cruel conclusion. As long as you don't eat, drink, or get sick, you'll be able to gather enough money in about 600 to 700 years. In an instant, he felt the pressure of life. The truth hope was badly damaged and could not rise again. Seeing that her performance had finally come to an end, Huaisher shook his head and added, "Someone has already paid for you." Huh? Zhen, she was in disbelief. "You don't have to ask about the specific process. Don't worry about it. I'll help you." Huaisher didn't want to let her imagination run wild, so he quickly typed, "There may be no hope for the position of the head of the family, but I will help you solve the problem in your body. However, there will be an extra charge of $1 million. In order to prevent her from treating this as a spring outing, Huaisher still had to give her a hard time. Otherwise, he felt that this girl would really become a salted fish at the speed of light and start to win without doing anything. Showing a hint of murderous intent, Miss Huaisher moved closer and raised her phone. "If you don't pay, you know what the consequences will be, right?" The dazed Zhen, she stood rooted to the ground. After a long time, she finally came to her senses. She was in disbelief and didn't know what had happened. However, panic quickly emerged in her heart. Subconsciously, she shrank back a little. It was as if she wanted to hide herself. "Miss Huaisher, you know everything? Everything is clear." Huaisher sighed and looked at her exposed ankle under the hem of her bathrobe. There was a faint scar on it. It seemed that it had just healed and hadn't completely healed yet. When he pulled Junxi's hand and rolled up her sleeves, he saw layers of scars on it. The damage to the body was a unique sign in the early stages of beast transformation. Because of this overly sensitive resonance with the abyss, it led to the erosion of precipitation, and eventually, the fragile body couldn't bear the changes of the source substance. Such a cracked scar formed between the skin and the muscle. This was the earliest origin and source of the name stigmata. This phenomenon had been appearing since the Middle Ages. Due to the influence of the subconscious, the wound may also form inexplicable and meaningless text shapes, but this didn't change the fact that the wound was a wound. At first, it was attributed to a revelation from God, and later, it was regarded as a symbol of a contract with the devil. It wasn't until modern medicine that it was collectively called coagulation syndrome. This was the original sin that beastmen or hybrids were born with. They were too far from heaven and too close to hell. They were destined to have no chance of miracles and could only embrace the end of disaster. It was this innate pain that made many beastmen at the border full of hatred for the current state and the current astronomy association and constantly tried to resist. The foundation of Green Sun existed on this soil. For that group of people, waiting for the current state to show mercy was tantamount to waiting for death. It was better to join Green Sun for a way to live, even if it was a little easier before death. It was better than painfully lingering at death's door. She inexplicably recalled the old scholar she saw in Jinling when she was kidnapped by the rumors. That pair of bestial vertical pupils full of hatred and anger. This was the proof of their misfortune. Huaisher was silent for a long time before pulling down the sleeves of his bathrobe and letting go of her hand. It was hard to imagine the scars under the bathrobe, but it must have brought pain all the time, right? He was curious from the bottom of his heart. How did this guy grow up so carefree? It really wasn't easy for him to be so careless even now, like a silly dog. But even if he was a silly dog, he still had to keep moving forward, shamelessly struggling, shamelessly living, stubbornly holding on to luck and a glimmer of hope. Just like how he used to be. Huaishur sighed, raised his hand, and pressed on her hair. Zhen, she looked up blankly, looked at the pair of eyes in front of her, and froze in place. There was no sympathy or pity as she expected, nor was he shaken by the pain on her body. But that quiet gaze made her feel exceptionally at ease. It was as if someone was by her side. Someone would stand by her side and stare at her in a sorry state, without encouragement or pity, just waiting for her to continue moving forward. Just looking at him like that, it was as if the loneliness was dispelled. Like sunshine, just looking at those eyes, she felt that her efforts all this time were not in vain. No matter how ugly the struggle was, it would not be without results. In the silence, Zhen, she lowered her head and could no longer hold back the tears of grievance. She hugged her friend tightly, choked, and cried out loud, like a child who finally found her way home. In the end, when she came back to her senses, tears and snot had already completely ruined Miss Paper's chest, and she confirmed again that Miss Paper really did not have any cup. Just thinking about it made her sad. She was so pitiful. If possible, Zhen, she wanted to share some of her own with her. But before that, shouldn't she apologize properly? I'm sorry, Miss Zhen, I'm so sorry. I'll help you wash it off. Please leave it to me. There won't be any problems. Right in front of her room, Zhen, she bowed her head and apologized profusely. She grabbed his sleeve and invited him in. I still have 2 sets of clothes to change into, if you don't mind. Huaishur raised his hand and knocked her on the head. Without hesitation, these clothes were prepared by the Rakimi family for their guests. So why was she in such a hurry? She even dragged her to change clothes, so she was probably in a hurry to see something indescribable and terrifying. He casually stuffed her back into her room. Then, she went back to her room to change clothes. She changed back into the little dress that Russell gave her. That bastard, he must have planned this for a long time. The size was completely suitable, and it actually looked pretty good when she wore it. Paired with Tangi's makeup, it was really pleasing to the eye. Look at this otherworldly and elegant temperament. Look at this lovely face and a pair of big eyes that could speak. Miss Huaishiki-san was still impeccable today. Like hell, Huaishur felt like his eyes were going blind. If this continued, he was afraid that he would step onto a terrible wrong path. The influence of young Master Ming's stigmata paired with women's clothing was too terrifying, and he was actually starting to get used to it. He could only hurry up and settle this mess here. Soon, he could say goodbye to women's clothing and return to being a popular teacher in the Ivory Tower, Nambo Bay. But the more he encouraged himself, the more Huaishur felt like he was planting a flag. Then, he thought about Great Master Ming's transformation and felt a headache. It seemed like the plan to collect stigmata and calamity had to be put on the agenda. Just as he was deep in thought, there was a knock on his door. It was an impatient and rude knock on his door, urging him to open the door quickly. After the door was opened, a few guests with ill intentions were revealed. They were obviously ascendants who had been through many battles. Their expressions were fierce, and they were ready to fight. But when they saw that the person who opened the door was such a beauty, they were instantly stunned. Behind them, a man who seemed to be in charge walked up and glanced at Huaishur's body with an unpleasant gaze, almost drooling. However, when his gaze fell on Huaishur's chest, he quickly felt regretful. It was as if he was heartbroken. Mother Kerr, why are you so upset? Huaishur's gaze became colder and colder. Miss Huaishiki-san, right? The leader looked at his face and smiled strangely. 4th young master invites you over. Chapter 624. So, was it because of the internal strife of the Rigian family? Huaishur couldn't help but want to roll his eyes and was about to close the door. He was too lazy to pay attention to them. He didn't believe that if he, the guest of the Rigian family, didn't go, these people would dare to fight here. But before the door was closed, the man with the staple food took a step forward and grabbed the gap of the door. His smile became more and more strange. Miss Zhen, she has already arrived and is waiting for you there. You don't want anything unpleasant to happen, right? Amidst the silence, Miss Susie's movements stopped in place. She raised her eyes and stared at him. After a long time, A smile that made them feel uneasy appeared on that pretty face. The middle-aged man's face twitched slightly. He suppressed the inexplicable uneasiness in his heart, stepped aside, and pointed to the back. "Please, madam." Although the process was full of twists and turns, the target didn't resist in the end, but very obediently followed behind them. The middle-aged man who led the way walked in front, looking happy. It seemed that what they saw in the courtyard was not a show. This woman and that bastard Jun, she really had a deep relationship. Otherwise, she wouldn't be so obedient. Unfortunately, she was caught and fell into the hands of the fourth young master. Perhaps, in the future, there would be another plaything. Huaishir, who was walking behind, felt more and more obvious dangerous atmosphere, and his eyes gradually calmed down. Obviously, the fourth young master's status in the Rigian family was not low. There was an independent courtyard, and it was heavily guarded. There were all kinds of security measures. Unfortunately, the fourth young master should be more than ordinary incompetent. He had such a high status, but he didn't have any supporters behind him. Even if they wanted to find an agent, the big conglomerates would have a vision, and they wouldn't want to find a useless person. This kind of bluff could scare Country Girl, but in front of Huaishir, it was so boring that he couldn't even smile. It was not worth mentioning. Not long after, he saw the fourth young master in the hall. There was still an unpleasant smell in the air that couldn't be washed away. Thinking of the two women who left the room in a hurry, it was not difficult to guess what happened here. Huaishir's expression suddenly became contemptuous. "Welcome, Miss Huaishir." The fourth young master stepped forward and extended his hand. "Ever since I met you, I've been looking forward to meeting you." After walking closer, his gaze became even more fervent. Even though they had already seen each other during lunch, they were still stunned when they saw each other again. It was hard for them to look away. She couldn't help but lick her lips and greet him politely. It was just that no one cared. Huaishir looked around and didn't see Shin Shadow. He frowned. The fourth young master's expression stiffened, and he slowly withdrew his hand. The middle-aged man from before walked to his side and whispered something to him. He suddenly understood. "I'm sorry. It seems that in order to let you come, the servants had to tell a little lie. But I promise, as long as our meeting this time is smooth enough, nothing unpleasant will happen." His threatening words did not work. Huaishir rolled his eyes. Feeling bored, he turned around to leave. But behind him, the door was shut. A few ascendants blocked the door, their eyes filled with eagerness. They could not wait any longer. Seeing that this stinky woman didn't know what was good for her, the fourth young master sneered, turned back to the sofa, crossed his legs, and said mockingly, "Although I don't know what kind of relationship you have with that bastard Shin, but you better understand that this is the home of the Rigian family. Not just anyone can cause trouble here." In silence, Huaishir shook his head and couldn't help but sigh. What was about to happen next was likely to be a delightful plot. The premise was that Miss Huaiji was really as pitiful and weak as they had expected. "To be honest, I'm not in a good mood right now because of some reasons. And now it's even worse." Huaishir reached out his hand, took out a cigarette from his pocket, tilted his head, and lit it. The low and hoarse voice made everyone stunned. They looked at Miss Huaishir's beautiful face in astonishment. Unbelievable. They couldn't understand what had happened then. As the rising smoke dissipated in the air, the face revealed a malicious smile without any warmth. "I have a rough idea of what you want to do. To be honest, I can understand the curiosity of adolescent boys about the body of the opposite sex. Since you can't wait, let's start." Miss Huaishir's hands fell down and pinched the hem of her pure white dress. Smiling, she lifted it inch by inch. "Do you want to know what's under a girl's dress?" Following Miss Huaishir's movements, under the pure white dress, there were threads of sticky darkness flowing out. They spread, and quickly expanded, turning into a billowing ink-like darkness. In the dead silence, there was the sound of a flood riot. The darkness surged, flowing on the ground, and rose up with screams. From within, countless scarlet eyes slowly opened, looking at the mortal world with greedy eyes. They were excitedly flapping their wings, waiting impatiently for the banquet to begin. Their thirsty eyes were full of greed. At this moment, along with the lifting of her skirt, an indescribable nightmare rose from the darkness. Along with the tragic cries, it revealed its disgusting and terrifying silhouette, trampling on all the ignorant souls who dared to look directly at it, tormenting the reason and spirit of every pitiful creature endlessly. The time had come for the stars to return. A great existence rose from the eternal darkness. Since then, it was an endless time of despair. After an unknown amount of time, the darkness slowly dissipated. The door opened again. The pure and lovely Miss Huaisher walked out from behind the door with light steps. She took the cigarette from the corner of her mouth and casually threw it on the ground. "Thank you for your hospitality." In the room behind her, there were only a dozen empty shells left. Their dull eyes stared at the speckless and moldless ceiling, without any spirit. Only the meaningless breathing continued. Along with the last remnant of his soul, he was immersed in the endless pain of the nightmare. One thing was certain. They had fully understood what they wanted to know. If there was a next life, they would probably never be curious about what was under a girl's dress. Such a big thing couldn't be hidden from others, especially when Huaisher didn't hide anything when he went in and out. He didn't even hide anything when the Rigian family asked. In the evening, the old warrior Inu Jiang knelt on the other side of the quiet room. He stared at the calm Huaisher opposite him and the restless Zhen Shi beside him. His expression was without any warmth. After thinking for a long time, he finally opened his mouth and said, "This old man already knows the details. Ping Xian, that trash was in the wrong first. Lady Huai, she showed mercy and spared his life. This is already an act of benevolence. Naturally, we can't ask for too much. If it was in normal times, they might have some complaints. But at such a critical time, it was unwise to offend an unknown ascender, especially when the Rigian family did such a shameful thing to a guest first. It would be fine if they could suppress it, but now that they couldn't, the Rigian family's last bit of dignity would be rubbed on the ground. Why bother? The older you are, the more timid you are. When people get older, they become more cautious. Because they know that their energy isn't as good as before, they know that they have more important goals to achieve. Without enough benefits, they don't want to easily offend others. Although when it was time to offend, this group of people would offend others more thoroughly than anyone else. They would definitely make sure that the other party would never be able to make a comeback. But since they couldn't do anything to the other party, and now wasn't the time, they could only seek a good ending. Inu Jiang glanced behind him. The burly warrior stood up, carrying a box forward. He knelt beside Huaisher and placed the box in front of Huaisher. After the box was opened, the light from the origin crystal illuminated his eyes. It was worth a lot. This is a small gift from the Rigian family to thank you for saving Miss Zhen Shi, as well as compensation for you. Please don't take it to heart." Inu Jiang bowed down and apologized without any reservation. Facing a person who wasn't even a quarter or a fifth of his age, he did enough etiquette. Huaisher didn't move and continued to look at him, waiting for the second half of his sentence. Inu Jiang looked up and spoke solemnly. "It is indeed a troubled time for the Rigian family, so we can no longer entertain guests. Please forgive us." He's trying to chase him away. Huaisher took out his phone and was about to speak when he heard the voice of the girl next to him. Although uneasy, he forced himself to calm down. "It's Zhen Shi, Grandpa Inu Jiang. She won't leave." She looked up and spoke to the old man who once controlled her fate. "Because I want to participate in the official selection for the patriarch position. I will hire Miss Huai Ji as my representative to compete in my place." In the silence, Inu Jiang didn't say anything, but he couldn't help but sigh. Sure enough, it's not that simple. Through the attitude between the two of them, he already understood what happened and vaguely guessed the worst possible outcome. "Miss Zhen Shi, the patriarch selection isn't as simple as you think." "I know," Zhen Shi replied. "When I left home, Mother told me that I might die. But I didn't come here to die. This isn't something that someone told me, nor is it something that was persuaded or bewitched by others, but something that I've already decided on before I came here." She said, "I am the eldest daughter of Rigian Seihei, The blood of the Rygian family flows in my veins. I came back this time to participate in the Rygian family's patriarch selection. It's that simple. Chapter 625. Inuji lowered his eyes, sighing silently. But right beside Huaishur, a roar sounded out. So you do have ulterior motives, you sneaky person. The tall and sturdy warrior stood up. A blazing origin substance fluctuation turned into a faint flame, enveloping his entire body. He angrily stared at the seemingly innocent Korihime in front of him, widening his eyes, not allowing her any chance to speak. Questions and answers are useless. Let me, Inuji Yoshi, measure whether or not you have the capacity to match your ambition. Huaishur could not help but want to sigh. So, can you people of Ingzhou not be so chinibu? Can you speak properly? And Inuji Yoshi had already raised his hand that had turned into black iron, pulling towards her. Boom! The entire room suddenly shook. A hurricane swept through. The long sleeves instantly shattered, revealing an iron-colored arm underneath, the veins bulging, the exaggerated muscles exploding with enough power to destroy iron walls. This was the inheritance from the 60th generation Tengu Yokozuna. After thousands of practice, it was an incomparably pure skill. Chumosumo. Out. The tea in the tea tray flew up, falling back into the cup, only leaving behind ripples. And Inuji Yoshi's movements stiffened in place, because in the same place, the kneeling Korihime raised a finger. Casually, she pushed it upwards. The sound of steel colliding exploded. The mechanical hand hidden under the glove shook slightly, but did not have the slightest bit of resistance, easily blocking Inuji Yoshi's explosive power. Only the tea beside her slightly rippled. But that was all. Inuji Yoshi's face was ashen, gradually turning red. But no matter how much strength he exerted, the strength that he was so proud of was unable to move this damned woman even an inch from her original position. Even it was slowly pushed up, little by little. Huaishur raised his eyes, looking at the ashamed and humiliated face, expressionless. This was purely the drummer's advanced citation. It seemed to be played down, but in reality, the number of fingers and strength were not absolutely related. Enough, Yoshi. Quan Jiang raised his eyes and looked over, telling him, "You are not her opponent. Moreover, isn't this all in accordance with the rules?" Inugawa Yoshi did not say anything. In his silence, he pulled back his hand and moved back to Inugawa Yoshi's side. Huaishur didn't counterattack or rush to give him a beating. Instead, he raised his head and looked at the old man in front of him. She waited for his reply, until Quan Jiang sighed. "Since Miss Shinichi said so, then from now on, this old man will register your name on the official list." He stared at the girl beside Huaishur and asked softly, "What does this mean? Do you understand? Starting from 5 minutes later, you will be the enemy of all your loved ones." Quan Jiang said in a deep voice, "No matter if it is your uncle, your brother, or your sisters, they have always been kind and reserved. But when the time comes, they will not let you live or die on your own. Instead, they will treat you as an opponent and look for your every weakness. Then they will use all means to defeat you until you fall into the abyss, without any possibility of turning back. No matter what agreement you have with who, it is not a strategy that you can sit back and relax. When necessary, I may even give up on justice and suppress you. Unless you are above everyone else, you will be trampled under their feet. Shinichi, the current Rygian family, is such a cruel place. Are you sure you want to come back?" In the silence, Shinichi's eyes trembled slightly. After a long time, she nodded. Her fingers that were grabbing Huaishur's clothes were so nervous that they turned white, but she was still holding on. "Very good." Not knowing if it was praise or mockery, Quan Jiang nodded. "As an elder of the Rygian family, I announce that from now on, you are also a candidate for the next head of the Rygian family. Shinichi, I hope you will not regret it. As the weakest one, your first battle will be tonight. I hope what awaits you at that time will not be a tragedy." He held his knees and slowly got up. Finally, he nodded to the little girl in front of him and turned to leave. But before he went out, He heard a voice behind him. It was Shinichi. Mr. Quan Jiang. The girl knelt down and bowed to the old man's back. She lowered her head and said goodbye softly. All this time, my mother and I have troubled you and Uncle Jiaoshan to take care of us. It's just my duty. The old man's footsteps paused for a moment. Then he pushed the door open and left. In the following time, no one came to disturb them. After moving to an independent courtyard, they didn't even have any servants. The large courtyard was cold and cheerless. It felt like the treatment was much worse than before. But in fact, for a candidate, this was the environment that they really needed. From the moment Shinichi nodded, anyone who dared to enter her residence was her enemy. In other words, even if Quan Jiang walked into this courtyard and was killed by Huaishur, no one could say anything. In the following days, except for the necessary appearance at lunch, they would spend most of their time here. For dinner, Huaishur didn't have to do anything. The girl from the countryside showed off the cooking skills that she learned at the place where she worked. Although he wanted to praise her, but a certain someone who was spoiled by feng shui felt that it was ordinary no matter how he ate. The ramen took a bit too long to cook. Because of the limited time, wasn't very good. For tamakayaki, the egg wasn't stirred long enough. The ratio of the fried dumpling fillings wasn't very accurate. Of course, there was no need to say such things that would spoil the mood. Eating was still eating, wasn't it? Huaishur used to eat vermicelli for every meal. But after the cooking demon got used to it, he still wanted to eat something with a little kick, with a faint expectation. Huaishur calmly leaned on the sofa and watched the variety show in Yingzhou, waiting quietly. Shinichi, who was originally very brave, was getting more and more nervous. As time went by, the night gradually deepened. The first cooking demon battle was about to begin. Because it wasn't an official competition of the cooking demon competition, it was absolutely impossible to allow dangerous people to appear in the current realm. Therefore, those strange judges wouldn't appear. The judges were the contestants of both sides. Simply put, they would cook for each other and eat, until one of them couldn't eat anymore. Either they would die from eating, or they would get sick from eating, or they couldn't take it anymore. Through their own works, they would show the essence of the abyss. If they couldn't take the other's work, they could only admit defeat. The battle between the cooking demons was that simple. Occasionally, there would be a situation where both sides would perish together, but this kind of situation was rare. Even if they did perish together, they would just perish together. Luck was also a part of the competition. If you didn't like it, don't play. How to put more evil in the creation, how to add the essence of corruption in the cooking, and how to digest the opponent's evil. Every part of the competition tested the strength and adaptability of the participating cooking demons. Under the deep night, a maid wearing a white beat mask led the way. All the way down, she led Huaishur and Shinichi into the underground space under the Rigian family's manor. It was spacious and huge, with a dome made of iron. Behind the grandstand that extended from the highest point, a few blurry figures could be vaguely seen. However, their appearances and faces couldn't be distinguished, and they didn't make any sound. They just whispered to each other through the curtain. What attracted the most attention was the audience on both sides of the arena. It wasn't as exaggerated as having no empty seats. This kind of thing couldn't be announced to the whole realm. Only the other candidates and their culinary demon representatives were here. When Huaishur raised her head, she immediately noticed a burly man with an earpiece standing at the back of the room, in the shadows where the lights couldn't reach. His body was covered in messy tattoos, and his body was as huge as a shedding bear. He sat on 2 chairs with his buttocks, and his arms were crossed as he looked at Huaishur. When Huaishur turned around to look at him, he whistled and gestured cheerfully. Long time no see. Huaishur looked away and ignored him. He found a seat in the empty arena with Makoto and sat down. Makoto was far enough away from the other contestants, but he could still see their expressions. Other than Hoopa, who didn't even look at Makoto, most of them were indifferent. They didn't look at her with disdain or anger. Instead, some of them were looking at the mixed-race girl who came all the way from the border to compete with them for the position of the head of the house. Don't be afraid. Just think of it as an audience at a cooking show. Don't smile too brightly when the camera shows you. Huaishur patted her shoulder and comforted her. After thinking for a while, he pulled out the disguised Lord of the Flies and put it in her hand. If someone tries to approach after I go down later, you can just shoot them. It has a lock, so you don't have to worry about missing. Makoto was stunned. She looked down at the gun in her hand, feeling as if she was holding a hot potato. Do I have to do this? For your safety, it's best. Don't show that I'm scared. Learn from your relatives. If you don't know what to do, just keep a straight face. If you don't want to hold it, just put it aside. The point isn't whether you dare to shoot, but whether they see it or not. Huaisha reached out and changed Lord of the Flies gear to trial mode. A cold aura spread out from the barrel of the gun. It was thin but sharp, and it stung all the eyes that dared to peek. Those sneaky eyes quickly retreated. Makoto followed Huaisha's instructions and casually put the gun on the chair next to her. Makoto, who was still scared, quickly adapted to the atmosphere in the arena and calmed down. Or, at least, she pretended to be calm. Even with her qualities, it was impossible for her to maintain vigilance at all times and be on guard against attacks. However, she could at least pretend to be calm in the face of danger. She couldn't react in time anyway. The rest was Huaisha's problem. When the bell rang, he walked into the arena and waited for his opponent, until there was a strange sound in the tunnel opposite him. It sounded like there was some sticky liquid flowing in the pipe. A figure shrouded in darkness slowly appeared. Chapter 626. When that figure emerged from the darkness, all the cooking demon contestants frowned. The middle-aged man dressed like a hippie raised his hand and lifted his sunglasses, revealing a stunned expression. It's just the opening match. Why did they arrange such a troublesome opponent? Do you know Aram? I met that guy in America half a year ago. The hippie Aram shook his head and said, he's a very troublesome opponent. He's slippery like a snake. Old Mr. should know that, right? A 2-star chef demon from Ingzhou. He's a rising star in recent years. I've heard a little about him. The stooped old man from Dongxiao leaned on his walking stick and studied the figure that was wrapped in resentment. He chuckled softly and said, Shun Jinxing, the head chef of 3 roads from Yashizaka. He's not easy to deal with. It seems that his mountain serpent cuisine has improved a lot compared to the last time we met. The younger generation will surpass us in time. Mr. Gua sighed at his own inferiority, like a dying old wave on the beach. If it weren't for the fact that this old man liked to use his peers to make steamed buns, others might have believed him. I heard that it's mountain serpent cuisine. Is it from Ingzhou? The burly tattooed chef demon rubbed his chin and asked in heavily accented Latin, I've never seen it before. What's so special about it? Oh, Mr. Vladimir, are you pretending to be a newcomer to gather information again? The tattooed chef demon smiled honestly. I really don't know. Is there any kind-hearted person who can explain it to me? Then we'll see. The hippie Aram didn't take the bait. He shrugged and said, we'll meet him sooner or later in the competition. Among the many chef demons, Shun Jinqing, who inherited the mountain serpent cuisine from Ingzhou, was undoubtedly one of the most difficult to deal with. No matter who it was, they would definitely be at a disadvantage the first time they met him. It was an extremely dangerous technique, whether it was to others or to oneself. Even with the chef demon's ability to withstand it, he might die. Vladimir smiled slyly. He didn't care that his opponent was hiding anything and started another topic. Then what about the other one? I don't know her. Aram shook his head and stared at the back of the woman called White Paper Moko with a confused expression. According to the list that he knew, there should not be such a cooking demon in Ingzhou. There was no symbol, and he did not carry any tools. It was obvious that he had hidden his identity. But even if she was a powerful character with such a beautiful appearance, she shouldn't be unknown. Could it be that he was a newcomer who didn't know the immensity of heaven and earth and came to participate in the duel after getting his license plate? That would be too naive. Even though they were both cooking demons, there was a decisive and terrifying difference in their star levels. Rashly challenging an opponent who was far stronger than oneself would really cause trouble. What do you think, Mr. Gua? Aram cunningly threw the topic to the old man. That's amazing. Scary, I always feel like I can't compare. After keeping Ji Hao in suspense, old Chef Gua grinned, showing his white and sharp teeth. Such a young and beautiful chef. Even I have never heard of such a young and beautiful chef. Isn't that amazing? The people around him couldn't help but want to roll their eyes. No one said anything. In the silence, only old Chef Gua's nose twitched a few times, and the permanent smile on his face became subtle. Such an aura, it smelled like Mount Tingno. But, other than that, there was a strange aura that he had never seen before. A bitter and moist air with the smell of plants, the coldness of bones, and the fragrance of children. Could it be the type that was similar to his sect? Or could it be that the teacher that he ate had another inheritance? In his throat, the wrinkled and loose skin suddenly swelled up, like a python swallowing an iron ball, swallowing his rapidly secreting saliva. He felt a strange hunger and thirst. It had been a long time since he was so full of appetite. It was the instinctive anticipation and hunger of a cooking demon. All of this kept telling him that there was something wrong with that woman. Staring at the name on the cooking table, Huaisher raised his head and looked at his opponent. It was as if he had been soaked in dirty water for who knew how long. That guy had a wet feeling. His long black hair clung to his face, and his smile was pale. He looked clean and capable, but there was always a pungent smell on him that couldn't be dispersed. It felt like something was rotten. While Huaisher was looking at his opponent was also looking at him. Oh, what a beautiful opponent. That's great, that's great. The middle-aged man stuck out his tongue and licked his dry lips, glancing at him with a faint smile, and Jin Shi, who was sitting in the audience seat behind him. Did you offend someone? Compared to the expressionless Huaisher, Zhan Shi still didn't change her expression, but her eyes couldn't help but wander, showing a trace of uneasiness and guilt. Your employer seems to be a little unconfident, madam. Shen Jinxing laughed with a hoarse voice, putting the toolbox in his hand beside him. He raised his head and suggested, "Before we start, do you want to admit defeat, madam? To be honest, your face is so perfect that I'm tempted. I really don't want to destroy this beauty." Huaisher wanted to retort back, but he was limited by his disguise and couldn't open his mouth. Wait a minute. Are all of you living your life based on looks? Can't you walk when you see a woman? He could only roll his eyes to show his disdain. Oh, did I offend you? Shen Jinxing chuckled strangely. If that's the case, then there's no need to say more. For the sake of that delightful face, I won't let the pain last too long. Beside him, the toolbox was opened. The sound of steel rubbing against each other was heard, and a 2-inch-long knife was pulled out. Under the dim light, it revealed a colorful and terrifying pattern. The essence extracted from countless poisonous substances was finally created into a sharp weapon that could dissect and kill all living things. That guy, he took out his trump card at the beginning of the match. Aram, who was in the audience, was stunned. It's really as the legends say, a pervert who likes to get excited when his opponent is weak. That was the true skill of Mountain Granny's cooking. The dark side of the mountains, the fallen mountain god, the projection of the divinity that grew and nurtured all things in hell. Things that once grew and nurtured turned into cold and ferocious things. After careful brewing and creation, it formed a terrifying poison that even the culinary demon couldn't withstand. It was obviously delicious and irresistible, but after eating it, only despair and death were left. Once the utensils were picked up, the diner's life was already under the Mountain Granny's kitchen knife. There was no irreverence or arrogance. Even though Shen Jinxing spoke frivolously, he chose to go all out from the beginning. There's going to be a good show to watch now. So are both sides ready? On the viewing platform that extended high up in the sky, behind the curtain, a coy voice that sounded like a castrate's pretentious posture sounded. As the High Emperor's envoy, the eunuch had white powder on his face. When he opened his mouth, the color of his teeth was pitch black. Everything here has been witnessed by the Emperor. Both sides must not hide anything or slack off. Understood? No one responded, but this was something to be expected. That messenger didn't mind and waved his hand, indicating that Quan Jiang, who was kneeling beside him, would take care of the rest. Thus, the old warrior stood up and took a step forward. His hoarse voice turned into thunder, echoing in this huge underground space. Then, fair and square, let's decide the victor. In that instant, the resounding bell sounded again. Kakik. Very good, very good. Shen Jinxing laughed loudly, his slender fingers pressing on the kitchen table. The entire table suddenly shook, and countless tools flew out from the shelves. Then, with a shake of his shoulders and a sticky sound, for arms stretched out from behind him, catching the falling tools and slowly spreading them out. Just like the eight-legged spider, it was entrenched in his own domain. The ingredients in the water tank beside him had already fallen onto the chopping board. It was a ferocious pufferfish. It was located at the border of Kyoto, Yoshimi Ryasaka. It was a famous chef shop with a history of over 600 years. It was a special breed raised by 3 roads, dragon pufferfish. It was 10 times, 100 times more delicious than ordinary pufferfish. At the same time, it was 10 million times more terrifying than a normal pufferfish. Its color was yellow and black, just like a flood dragon. The enormous pufferfish sinisterly twisted in the air, choosing its prey to swallow. But in the wake of Shun Jinxing's smooth movements, the multicolored short knife scattered, and the tiger pufferfish's slippery body was already cut open in the air. It didn't even have time to swell its body and release sharp spikes before its innards flowed out. Then, he began to coldly dissect and slice it. But what was astonishing was that even though it had already been dissected into a skeleton, the pufferfish's mouth was still opening with difficulty. It was still alive. In order to maintain the peak of freshness and taste, Three Roads was famous for this point in Hell's pufferfish cuisine. Even in the instant it was served on the table, all the way until the honored guest ate, it was still able to maintain its vitality, exploding the diner's taste buds like a bomb. As for whether it was poisonous or not, that depended on the chef's mood. However, if it was a cuisine, it definitely wouldn't be as simple as sashimi. As the inheritor of mountain serpent cuisine and one of the head chefs of Three Roads, Shen Jinxing wouldn't simply deliver this kind of unsightly natural poison to his opponent's table. In his hands, countless strange, colored poisons had already been pulled out from the toolbox. They were processed smoothly like moving clouds and flowing water. Then, they were thrown into the burning cauldron and began to boil the base of the thick soup. This was the essence of sashimi, handheld, tempura, hot pot, mixed cooking, and the last white dessert after gathering all kinds of fierce poisons. Hell's killing dragon, Iron Cannon Banquet. A vague shadow appeared behind him. It was like a river formed by amber wine, the unceasingly flowing poisonous water of the underworld on the Three Roads River. Resonating with the power from hell, this malice created by humans gave birth to the prototype of calamity. Just a sniff made Huaishi's appetite soar. In the Cage of Dreams, a group of crows began to caw loudly. They were already impatient, but compared to the opponent's all-out effort, Huaishi Suko was unusually lazy. Unhurriedly, she reached out and rummaged through the cabinet of the kitchen counter. She didn't even plan to use her own tools. Then, she took out a mixing bottle. After weighing it for a while, she found it to be quite handy. Miss Suko's lips curled into a happy smile. This is it. Chapter 6:27. Just like that, they were dozens of meters apart. In front of Shinjin and under the gaze of all the cooking demons, Huaishi placed the wine-mixing pot on the cooking table and poured in 200 milliliters of purified water. He turned around, opened a refrigerator, and took out 2 pieces of non-bubble ice cubes. He threw them into the pot and closed the lid. Then he was done. He didn't put anything else in. Accompanied by the dull sound of the ice cubes colliding, the wine-mixing pot spun in Miss Susie's hand and flew up nimbly. After drawing an arc in the air, it fell again. It was like a tamed animal. The wine-mixing pot jumped, rolled, and shook nimbly between Huaishi's arms and fingers. If it wasn't for the fact that it wasn't a magician's trick, people would almost think that there was an invisible rope tied to the pot in his hand, which was why he could make such astonishing and rich movements. It was dazzling. He didn't process the ingredients, nor did he light the stove. He didn't even use any tools. He just casually shook the wine-mixing pot in his hand in the arena, as if he was going to make a cup of cappuccino for the Annie's present. But cappuccino wasn't done like that. Moreover, everyone could clearly see that there was no coffee in the pot, not even a single soybean. It was as if he was joking. It was hard to understand. What is he doing? Juggling? Isn't he mixing drinks? Vladimir scratched his chin and said in confusion, "There are also cooking demons who focus on drinks, right? It doesn't seem to be something rare." Yerim, who was dressed like a hippie, couldn't help but roll his eyes. Mixing drinks? This was called mixing drinks? He could bet that as long as there was a gram of alcohol in the bottle, he would eat the bottle with cephalosporin today. This was purely ice water, right? Roar, pleasing the eyes is also a part of the culinary performance. Old cooking demon Gwistil maintained the appearance of someone with late-stage Alzheimer's disease. He looked very, very powerful, which made people extremely angry. However, in his eyes, which were covered in gray spots and white shadows, his pupils contracted slightly, and an obscure electric light flashed through. Aura inspection method. Searching for dragons and breaking acupoints. The origin substance technique used to measure the aura of the earth was used in his eyes. In that instant, he keenly sensed that something was wrong. What was that? In Huaishir's hand, there was a strange fluctuation hidden in the flask. Like an obscure whirlpool, it rotated silently without spreading any heat. Instead, it extracted all the heat and poured it into the whirlpool. It caused the temperature of the entire underground space to drop slightly, but not many people were able to notice this subtle change. It was precisely at that moment that the steel arm under Huaishir's long-sleeve gloves silently cracked open. The furnace in the darkness lit up with fine sparks. The forging, no, the cooking had begun. For more than half an hour, Huaishir was casually shaking the flask in his hand. Other than that, he did nothing else. It was as if he had completely given up on the competition. He looked like he had given up. In other directions, the gazes of others were becoming more and more mocking. Maki fidgeted in her chair and clenched her fists as she stared at the man's back. Although they didn't know what was going on, it seemed like the current situation was overwhelmingly unfavorable for them. But as long as she saw Miss Huaishir's calm expression, she inexplicably felt a trace of confidence. The situation wasn't that bad. There was still room for them to turn the tables. Very quickly, she smelled the scent that was gradually spreading through the air. Or rather, at this point, no one could ignore the scent that was brewing in the air, and the fragmented, boiling scent that gradually reverberated in their ears. It was the sound of countless bubbles rising and spreading in the clay pot, bringing with them the unique flavor of thick soup. They rose from the boiling cauldron, creating ripples and waves in the rich, milky white soup, rippling between the mushrooms and the vegetables. When they came into contact with the air, the thick fragrance contained within the bubbles would instantly explode, merging with the wind and flying in all directions. It was like a volcano that was about to erupt, unstoppable. The frightening sweetness in the pot constantly seeped out of the cracks in the lid, turning into wisps of hot steam that lingered at the tip of everyone's nose, bringing with it an undisguised and frightening temptation. The moment they smelled the fragrance, they already had the so-called awareness. Even if it was hell in front of them, they still wanted to explore it, wanted to try that kind of delicious taste, even if that extreme and excessive freshness would devour them. The crisp sound of the kitchen bell rang. From Shun Jinqing's hand. The cooking was over. As the shadow of the underworld dissipated, the eyes of the skinny middle-aged man lit up with a strange flame. He looked at the opponent in front of him with a ferocious smile. "Can we begin, Miss Huaishir?" The sound of splashing water came to an abrupt end. The mixing jug fell on the table. Like a dice cup, everything was settled. Huaishir raised his eyes and stared at the cooking table in front of Shun Jinqing. A white-hot mist shrouded everything, hiding the ferocious claws and teeth. But the tempting fragrance wafted in the air, beating the hunger and restlessness in his stomach. He couldn't wait. She turned around and washed her hands at the sink. Miss Huaishir pulled out a chair and sat in front of the table, finally showing a smile of anticipation. She waited quietly. The banquet of death, named Iron Cannon, began. It's rare to meet such a beautiful guest. It makes people excited. Shen Jinxing walked in with a smile and put on the first dish. Today is a full set of iron cannon banquet, using the most delicious parts of 3 puffer fish. The portion is a little big. If you can't eat it, don't force yourself. But I believe that Miss Huaishir will definitely not refuse such a generous offer. It was like a blooming peony. Rows upon rows of glittering and translucent sashimi were arranged neatly between the plates that were adorned with various bright-colored lettuce. The pure white colors converged and overlapped in one place like a flourishing flower, exuding a refreshing and sweet fragrance. When the chopsticks picked up, each extremely thin and flexible piece of fish reflected the light and glowed faintly. He didn't know how many times he had practiced and how much effort and time he had poured into it to create the small piece in Huaishir's hand. The texture was perfectly cut, maintaining the same shape and uniform flavor of each piece, and the small piece of sashimi was so pleasing to the eye. It was really amazing. It was just that it was only sashimi. There is no such thing as orange vinegar, radish puree, and white onion. The puffer fish in our restaurant doesn't need the assistance of other sundries. As long as you taste it, you will understand that unnecessary foreign objects will only tarnish this precious taste. Shen Jinxing raised his head and declared confidently. Huaishir opened his mouth and swallowed a piece of sashimi. It was as if a delicious bomb had been detonated in an instant. When the elastic texture of the fish was chewed by his teeth, the fresh and sweet juice burst out from the gaps between his teeth, teasing the taste buds on his tongue, and breaking out the unique sweetness of the fish and the terrifying freshness that was difficult for ordinary things to reach. It was extremely simple, without any makeup or fancy. Although there was no time to mature it, the taste was still not inferior to any other of the same kind. Indeed, as Fujin had said, all external things would only dull the freshness of the dish. Only by tasting it would one be able to deeply experience the vitality that had long seeped into every cell of the body. The more he chewed, the deeper he could feel the sweetness lingering around the tip of his tongue. But then, it became emptier. Before he swallowed the last piece of fish, Huaishir had already picked up the next piece of sashimi. He couldn't wait to open his mouth. As early as the moment he took the first bite, Huaishir had already understood something. This pure natural freshness was indeed a field that he could not reach now. The previous chefs of Three-Way Restaurant had studied for many years, cultivated many generations of fish, and improved many processes to deduce the flavor of the pufferfish to the extreme. How could an outsider like him easily enter the field? 1 piece, 2 pieces, 3 pieces. When the gurgling freshness turned into a mellow and rich flavor, Huaishir was already intoxicated and could not stop. That's right, that's it. Shen Jinxing grinned and smiled, and the flames in his eyes danced. This was the unshakable confidence of Chef Three-Way Restaurant. No matter how picky a diner was, once they took the first bite, they would be captured by this natural demonic nature without exception. Then, step by step, they would walk into the abyss, and there would be no turning back. Oh no! In the audience, old cooking demon Gwen narrowed his eyes and chuckled strangely. He actually stepped into the trap without any precautions? Did he have confidence in himself? Or was he completely ignorant? Even as a veteran monster-level cooking demon, he was still afraid of Three-Way Restaurant's Iron Cannon Banquet. That was a terrifying bewitchment that led people step by step into a desperate situation. Once indulged for the first time, it would be out of control. When Huaishir's movements finally stopped, he realized that the plate of sashimi in front of him was already empty. The freshest and sweetest part of the whole Dragon River pufferfish had been completely eaten by him. However, he didn't feel full at all. Instead, he became more and more hungry and thirsty, wanting more. He didn't have to wait long. Then the second dish was served. Fishbone tempura, please. Shen Jinxing smiled and put down another wine cup. Please taste it together with the fish fin wine. Kang 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 kang. Kang 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 kang. When the chopsticks put the tempura into his mouth, there was a crisp sound. In the silence, it was so clear and penetrating. Crack! The crispy explosive broke between his teeth. After being fried by the grease, the wonderful fragrance in the heat was covered in a bright coat. Accompanied by the crisp sound, it danced on the tip of his teeth. It was a taste completely different from the freshness of the fish. After a simple processing, the wonderful taste contained in the fish bones flowed from the tip of the tongue into the stomach, along with the crispy texture. Without any prompting, Huaisha picked up the wine cup beside him and drank the sake in one gulp. In an instant, the sake surging with the fragrance of the fish fin flowed into his throat and mixed with the aftertaste of the fish bones. It was ignited. A heat wave hit his face, and his long hair danced in the air. He felt his whole body being completely surrounded by this hearty heat. Then, he held the fish liver in his hand. The mellow fish liver melted in his mouth and seeped into his soul, turning into a taste that was even better than sashimi and above common sense. He chewed crazily, almost unable to stop. The moment the pufferfish pot was finally served on the table. Finally, the dagger was revealed. Chapter 628. The current Huaisha was completely captivated by this deliciousness. When the lid of the casserole was lifted in front of him, it was as if a mighty torrent was gushing out from within, turning into a shadow that stretched its neck and screamed. In the middle of the milky white boiling soup, the cooked tofu had a jade-like luster, and the green vegetables and mushrooms rose and fell in the thick soup, revealing an incomparable temptation. Even more shocking was the strange fragrance that was enough to drown a person. Suffocating, completely unable to breathe. Forgetting to breathe, Huaisha's appetite could no longer be stopped by anything. Every cell, every strand of origin substance exuded a strong thirst. Countless crows crazily screeched in the bone-burying sanctuary, their insatiable thirst burning. He could no longer feel the existence of his body. At this moment, the only thing that remained was an instinctive desire to eat. He wanted to devour. He wanted more. Even if what he swallowed was a vicious poison that could kill him, he would not hesitate. "Please, Miss Huaiji, this is your fate." Shen Jinqing smiled and presented a bowl of thick soup, placing it in front of Huaisha. The tender white fish rose and fell in the soup, and the thick soup rippled with specks of starry light. Between the mushrooms and vegetables, the bouncing tofu reflected a sparkling light. Without any hesitation, Miss Huaiji picked up the soup bowl, opened her mouth, and almost went berserk. Wisps of green rose from her neck, climbing up her face bit by bit, interweaving into a sinister spider web. This caused the beautiful face that was intoxicated by the gluttony to become incomparably sinister. An endless stream of origin substance began to rise from the slender figure, corroding everything around it and dyeing it a strange, deep purple. That was poison. That's right, with the pufferfish as the foundation. After fusing with the blood of countless people, it evolved into the abyss poison. This was the most precious part of the dragon pufferfish. It had a noble status that was close to that of the master of the river. If one traced its roots, it could even inherit the noble dragon bloodline. Even though there were no more true dragons in the world, the demonic nature of the abominable flood dragon was becoming more and more violent. Under the abyss cooking demon's mediation, with this as the foundation, the innate poison of the pufferfish and countless acquired poisons were fused together, making the dish seem as if it had given birth to life. They were granted the embryonic form of a soul, forming a calamity that was not inferior to any abyssal creation. As Huaisha ate, bit by bit, it accumulated in his body until the moment it exploded, and everything was already irreversible. Countless toxins fused together and seeped into his soul, contaminating it from the inside out and causing an irreversible change to his origin substance. The combination of Shangrong cuisine and the secret of the three roads was the supreme masterpiece completed by Fujin K. No one could resist the temptation of Tao Tai. No one could resist the solidifying disaster, and no one could dispel the terrifying curse. Demonic poison. The great general of the three roads praised it as the essence of malice that could enter the sixth heaven in his lifetime. Just a trace of the poison leaked out of Huaishi's body, causing the bricks under his feet to begin to decay. An irresistible aura of decay spread out, enveloping the slender figure within. After the poison entered his soul, the demonic nature created by it began to erupt. The attendants at the side of the arena retreated in horror. They were only slightly affected by the poison, and they saw their own limbs begin to rapidly decay, deform, and twist into strange shapes. They didn't even have the chance to scream. They melted and turned into viscous blood that flowed. The fierceness of this highly toxic poison moved even the spectating, cooking demons. They felt a deep sense of fear from the bottom of their hearts. Fujin K grinned. That's right, fear. From a moment of the opening match, this shadow had been planted in his heart and soul. In every subsequent match, he would exhaust all his mental and physical strength to guard against it. But guarding against it would be useless. The rules of the showdown between cooking demons innately placed him in the most advantageous position, no matter how much he guarded against it. When he entered his own domain step by step, he would no longer be able to resist the attraction of the demonic nature. If he did not hesitate to die, to eat the puffer fish, then this deliciousness that surpassed ordinary puffer fish would bring about a terrifying outcome that was thousands of times more tragic than death. The premise was if the poison could really work. At this moment, Fujin K finally felt that something was wrong. When a soup in the bowl was finished in one gulp, what he heard was not a terrified scream, but an excited sigh and moan. Then, the empty soup bowl was thrown to the ground. It was not a pity. Thirst, a thirst that had been detonated. Countless iron crows were crazily restless at this moment, continuously transmitting their thirst to Huaishir. They were thirsting for food, thirsting for more. Huaishir snatched the spoon from Fujin K's hand. Then, he picked up the boiling hot earthenware pot and placed it in front of him. In the fragrant and rich soup, a pair of scarlet eyes were reflected. They were filled with anticipation and joy. Impatiently, he lifted the spoon and scooped up a full spoonful of the mushrooms, fish, and soup. He poured it into his open mouth. The sound of chewing that made one's scalp numb rang out. Just like that, he swallowed the boiling soup into his stomach, along with the thousands of times more violent poison, without leaving a single drop outside. He allowed the demonic nature to surge in his soul, and allowed the changing poison to corrode his body. Let go of the Tao Tai. Fujin K was stunned on the spot, frozen, and his smile gradually shattered, because at this moment, what rose in Fujin K's body was no longer the changing poison that he was proud of, but a dreamlike light. It was so beautiful that it was intoxicating, but it was also fleeting as if it did not exist in this world. Her existence had turned into a bubble, shattering with a touch. But from that pair of eyes, a blazing light that could steal one's soul was emitted. 1,000 beautiful dreams and 1,000 nightmares overlapped, and at this moment they were shattered. The despair, terror, pain, and once abundant happiness that surged within spread together, soaring into the sky, forming a violent vortex. No matter how the demonic poison changed, it could not break free from that terrifying gravitational force. Along with the food, it was cruelly chewed, swallowed, and fell into her stomach, becoming a part of her, an insignificant nourishment for that terrifying dream. That was indeed a vicious poison that was created with meticulous planning and painstaking effort, a demonic cooking that Huaishir admired and was incomparably intoxicated. But at this moment, in front of him, it was food, resources, something necessary for growth. It was a stepping stone for the growth of the crows. It was really delicious. If possible, Huaishir wanted to cheer, to loudly praise, to acknowledge Fujin K's outstanding talent and skill. As expected of the mountain maiden's cooking, as expected of the 3 roads. He could not stop at all. Huaishir was intoxicated in this moment of enjoyment, so moved that he almost shed tears. The delicious disaster rolled in his mouth, chewed, swallowed, and was immediately absorbed by his soul, transforming into the pure essence of the abyss, nourishing countless hungry crows. This joy of growth was really too wonderful. But not long after, this heartfelt joy suddenly came to an abrupt end. Huaishir's movements paused. He lowered his head from ecstasy, falling into a daze. In front of him, the earthenware pot was already empty. The cups and plates were in a mess, and there was nothing left. The iron cannon banquet was over. It was over. Huaishir raised his head and looked at the demonic cooking in front of him in confusion, full of confusion and doubt. The first thing he felt was regret, then disappointment, and finally anger. Indescribable anger. It was over just like that? What on earth was going on? Wasn't this just the beginning? He was not full yet. No, it should be said that his appetite had just arrived, and it was already gone? Was it only this much? Was this a joke? Compared to the magnificent despair he had seen before, which was like a surging sea of darkness, this was just a cup of sugar water with a little more exquisite seasoning. Just this. Just this. Just this. In the dead silence, Shun Jinqing's expression twitched, and he could not help but stagger back a step. His face was pale. He was clearly such a beautiful and coquettish beauty, but he could no longer feel any beauty and carefree. Being looked at by that pair of eyes, he felt fear from the bottom of his heart. It was as if a ferocious behemoth was slowly rising in front of his eyes. A huge and dark shadow spread out, covering and swallowing him. The beautiful disguise was torn apart, revealing the terrifying essence. It was an immeasurable abyss, a vortex of gluttony that he could never satisfy with his insignificant skills. Only a pair of ferocious eyes looked down at him, full of disappointment and disdain. More! An angry roar rang out from his soul, a roar of rage. Trash, give me more. But there was nothing more. Shun Jinqing's all-out iron cannon banquet, the demonic poison that he was so proud of, was completely defeated by this pair of eyes that seemed to come from the abyss. What was even more painful and despairing was the cooking demon's self-restraint and integrity. The culinary demon, who was willing to step into the abyss for the sake of the ultimate cuisine, was actually unable to satisfy the needs of his customers. He couldn't even fill their stomachs. Even after trying his best, he was only able to make her appetizer. There is nothing more despairing and painful for a chef than this. Even the century-old reputation of the 3 roads would be shamed because of this. How could this be? From this moment on, Shun Jinqing's last bit of fighting spirit completely disappeared. He lay limp on the ground, unable to move. Soon, Huaishir woke up from his thirst and regained his composure. After wiping his mouth, he regretfully looked at the empty bowl in front of him. Although he was disappointed, he maintained his respect for his opponent and his appreciation of this delicious dish. He put his palms together and expressed his gratitude. Next, it was his turn. Waving his hand, he motioned for the frightened attendants to come forward and clean up the table. Then he first took out a wide-mouthed wine cup that he had prepared beforehand, put an ice cube in it, opened the wine flask that had been placed there for a long time, and poured the ice water into the cup. Finally, he picked up the spoon and casually tapped the cup's rim. The fine vibration broke the original balance, and the chill sealed and the ice water spread out, causing a thin layer of frost to hang on the cup. Thus, it was a success. Huaishir gestured to the dazed Shun Jinqing in front of him. Please, Your Excellency, Shun Jinqing. With such an expectant smile, Motoko Huaishir finally revealed the joy and ferocity of a predator. Now, it's your turn to comment on my work. Chapter 629. Inside the glass, the surface of the water was still swaying slightly, reflecting a faint glow. Everyone couldn't help but stretch their necks forward to take a closer look. They frowned. What's this? Water? Nonsense. Anyone with eyes can see that it's water. But what's this thing doing? A cooking demon from Ingzhou pinched his chin and thought for a long time. It looks like it's cut with water. Good technique, clean and neat. Cut with water. Originally, the popular drinking method in Ingzhou was to add water to reduce the alcohol content so that people could taste the wine better. At first, it was used on sake. Later, when foreign liquors like whiskey entered the market, it quickly became popular. After adding ice and water, mix it well until there's frost on the glass. It's cut with water. Nonsense. Who here couldn't see that it was cut with water? But the problem was, what did you cut? Cut with water to cut sake and whiskey? What kind of new type of matryoshka doll was this? Moreover, in the glass, it should be pure water, right? No carbon dioxide was added. So where did all the bubbles come from? It doesn't feel good. Aram was hesitant, so he turned and asked, Old Mr. Well, what do you think? Oh, I know a thing or two about this. Old Chef Gua smiled like an old chrysanthemum, rubbing his knees. After a long time, he said, this should be the famous Dongsha dish, boiled cabbage. For a moment, countless question marks appeared on everyone's heads. What the hell? Boiled cabbage? Is there a problem with me or with you? Do you Dongsha people like to talk about this whenever you're cooking? How can there be such boiled cabbage? Maybe it's a subspecies. Old Chef nodded calmly. Cooking has to be innovative. Don't joke around. If it's boiled cabbage, then where's the boiled water? Old Chef shrugged. It's been too long. It's cold. Then where's the cabbage? Maybe you forgot to put it in? The old man had an unfathomable and terrifying look on his face, causing the others to be too lazy to continue listening to his nonsense. Because Huaisher had already picked up the sticky note on the side, wrote a note, and stuck it on the cup. He thoughtfully wrote the introduction. Creative cuisine. Heartache. This was a brand new result that he had come up with on a whim. After combining the skills of the creator, it was a completely reborn fad, otaku, sad water v3. 0. After that, Miss Huai smiled and pointed at the cup, looking at Shun Jinqing, eagerly anticipating. Please, my friend. Choo-choo, choo-choo, Shun Jinqing, on the other hand, was silent. He sat on the chair, dumbstruck. He seemed to have finally awoken from his previous shock. Staring at the cup in front of him, his expression changed and gradually twitched. He suppressed his anger. However, the rage that was growing stronger and stronger was difficult to restrain, causing his eyes to widen and his face to turn ashen. Stop joking around, Huaiji. Shun Jinqing angrily rebuked. Will you take cooking for? Was this a joke? For this kind of thing, even if I die here and jump down from here, I will never. His angry voice came to an abrupt end, because there was a thick shadow covering his face, blocking the light in his eyes. From a close distance, Huaiji Motoko lowered her head and looked down at the opponent in front of her. She didn't speak, just silently stared. But when he was looked down at by that pair of pitch-black eyes, there was no doubt that he felt the pressure from it. That was telling him, drink it. She was warning him. It was as if she wanted to implant that inexplicable brutality into the soul in front of her. She coldly gave an absolute order to the ingredients on the chopping board that could not be disobeyed. There was no need for words. That indifferent and mocking meaning had been deeply engraved in his soul. She whispered in his ear, Shun Jinqing, you are already a mature adult. Don't be picky like a child, okay? If you want to make trouble because you can't eat the candy, then I will give you some sweetness. In front of him, Huaiji Motoko pulled over the seasoning plate, opened the lid, and casually and perfunctorily pinched a pinch of candy and threw it into the cup in front of her. It was as if this would make the ice water taste better. This was the last mercy. Now, she raised her eyes again, bent down, and got closer to him. She stared into his eyes at a close distance and gave him her final order. Drink it for me. Being stared at by that pair of eyes, he felt as if he had fallen into an abyss and lost his last will to resist. He couldn't help but reach out and pick up the cup. By the time Shun Jinqing reacted, his lips were already pressed against the edge of the cold cup. He tilted it, and a stream of cold water flowed into his mouth. It went down his throat, and the refreshing coolness spread. He couldn't help but let out a long breath. He felt refreshed. Unexpectedly, it was sweet and tasty. No, it should be said that it refreshed his mind. The coarse sugar that had been casually grabbed spread through his chest along with the coldness of the ice water. It was as if he was standing in front of cold wind, as if he could see the withering plum blossoms of early spring wither on the branches. Stooped and humble, his eyes gradually became hazy. There was clearly no alcohol, but he felt as if he was drunk. He was intoxicated by this wonderful origin substance and recalled that winter. In that instant, he felt that something was wrong. His pupils subconsciously contracted, and he wanted to resist. But immediately afterwards, an illusion appeared in front of him. That year, snow fell from the sky, and a young girl stood alone on a plum blossom tree. The fluttering snow landed on her hair and shoulders, gradually covering the small mole on the back of her neck. It could no longer be seen, and only her snow-white skin remained. When she turned around to look at him, her eyes were like ink, and the youth's heart began to beat wildly. Very quickly, that illusion disappeared in front of his eyes. "Ah Tao," he muttered absent-mindedly, falling into a trance. After that, how many years had it been since he remembered her appearance? Even he himself had forgotten those buried memories. Now, when the after-images of the past reappeared, he once again felt intoxicated amidst his confusion. He couldn't help but take another sip. By the time he realized that it was poison, it was already too late. Because the remaining sweetness in his mouth gradually became sour, in the midst of his confusion, he gradually recalled that short and painful youth that belonged to him and only him. "Ah Tao, that's the headmaster's daughter. How is it? She's a beauty, right? Aya, I'm so envious. Why can't I have a daughter like that? You brat, you're not in heat, are you? Hurry up and get back to work. Don't let your imagination run wild." The work of the 3 roads was very busy, especially the apprentices. Not only did they have to do odd jobs, but they also had to serve tea and be responsible for running errands for their masters and seniors. Like servants, they were busy every day until dusk. The slightest mistake would be mercilessly whipped and reprimanded. Many of his companions in the same batch couldn't stand such cruel treatment and quit. Only he persisted. He gritted his teeth, held back his tears, and didn't know how many sleepless nights. Finally, he endured the most difficult years. In the end, he received the favor of the headmaster and was accepted as an official disciple. It wasn't until that day, when he saw Ah Tao again at the banquet, that he vaguely understood. Perhaps he was able to endure that long torment, not because of his innate character or perseverance, but because he wanted to see her again. The interaction between the two of them was just that. The meeting under the corridor, the smile they saw every day at dawn and dusk, and the fragrance that remained in the air when they brushed past each other. It made him gradually intoxicated, and gradually he couldn't extricate himself. His mind was occupied by that figure. He missed her face, her back, and her body crazily. He did so many shameful things just to get closer to her, even if it was just a little bit. He was like a loyal dog. As long as it was Ah Tao's words, he would listen. As long as it was something she wanted, he would buy it. As long as it was something she wanted to do, he would do it no matter what. Until one day, he saw someone else holding her in his arms. How long ago was that scene? Why was it still so vivid in his mind? Every time he thought of it, he couldn't help but feel a dull pain in his heart. He couldn't breathe. He lowered his head and subconsciously loosened his bow tie. He picked up the glass of water and drank a mouthful, trying to use the ice water to suppress the frustration in his heart. The excessive sugar spread and mixed with the sour taste, leaving only an indescribable bitterness. Jealousy. This was the taste of jealousy. When she was with that person, Ah Tao actually showed a beautiful smile that he had never seen before. It was like the sun, deeply piercing Shun Jin's heart, making him almost go crazy. If only she could be happy. As long as she lived well, it didn't matter what happened to him. He could only comfort himself with such a reason. He curled up in a corner where the sun couldn't find it, gradually becoming as humble as dust. But happiness didn't come. After she got pregnant with that person's child, Ah Tao was dumped by that scumbag. She became completely different from the past. Not long after, she was in a pair with a new boyfriend. Her smile was still the same. But gradually, it was different from the past. Then, she was betrayed and abandoned again and again. It was all the fault of that group of bastards. Every time after they broke up, Atao would cry and complain to him. Every time, he wanted to muster up the courage to say the words in his heart. Perhaps the next one could be him. At that time, he would never let her be hurt like that. Countless times, Shinjin made such a vow. It wasn't until late one night that a rosy face with a faint smell of alcohol came over and scrutinized his face, her eyes roaming. "Oh, I know." She smiled. "Shinjin-kun, you must not have hugged a woman before, right?" She whispered in his ear. "As long as you have tasted that feeling once, you won't be so embarrassed. How about it? Do you want me to help? Take it as a reward for all this time." Crack! In Shun Jinxing's hand, a crack appeared on the glass. That was the sound of a dream breaking. Shin Jinxing had forgotten how he answered at that time. He only remembered that he lowered his head, shamefully and embarrassedly, escaped. He wanted to escape to a place where even the shadow couldn't catch up. He wanted to forget everything. From then on, it was a long and empty time. On the field, Shun Jinxing had long been immersed in the bubbles of the dream, throwing everything to the back of his mind. He just swallowed the bitterness in the glass in big mouthfuls. Unknowingly, tears streamed down his face. Why did it become like this? Since when did everything become different? He had never noticed it. But what about her? Did she really know his feelings? In the silence, tears gradually fell into the glass, wetting his palm drop by drop. Then they quickly evaporated. It was as if he wasn't holding a glass of water, but a red-hot iron. In the terrifying heat, his hand gradually burned into charcoal, making a sizzling sound. That was the heat hidden in the wine glass finally erupting. As the ice water decreased, it began to spread. Clearly, as long as he let go, he would be free, but Shin Jinxing was reluctant to let go. He just shed tears and sipped the boiling bitter wine in a daze. He just wanted to see that illusion again. Once again, he wanted to return to the first time he saw her under the plum blossoms. He stared at the girl bathed in snow and told her what he had always wanted to say. "Miss Atao, I love you from the bottom of my heart." He said such words from his cracked heart in such a humble way. But no one responded. Shin Jinxing closed his eyes and fainted. But even as he fainted, he continued to cry and gripped the glass of water tightly. Even if the rescuers used iron pliers, it would be difficult to pry it open. To the side, Huaishir was dumbfounded. It had to be said that this was the result of the inspiration he had obtained from observing a certain person. He had used the corrosive origin substance in the dream cage as the material to transform all kinds of emotions and reforge it. The water was just water. The only thing that had merged with it was an insignificant bubble seed. With the illusion of joy as the starting point, it gradually fell under the guidance of the ashes until it was unable to extricate itself from the pain of despair. This was the watercutter dream. Unfortunately, dream manipulation was not Huaishir's forte, so she could only rely on the buffs from the decaying dream fragment and the forger's forge. Not only could it not be stored for a long time, but it also took an astonishingly long time to create. Limited by his skill, it had to be swallowed by the other party before it could germinate. It would grow along the other party's soul and bring the greatest pain. This was a poison coated with a layer of sugar. Compared to that kind of nightmare, the high temperature of the glass was just an addition. It could only be said that he had taken advantage of the cooking demon tournament. He could not imagine what Shun Jinxing had seen, nor could he empathize with him. However, he could more or less guess from his external performance. Then, he felt admiration from the bottom of his heart. After all, a bootlicker was a real cow. Not long after, the result was clear. Shun Jinxing was judged to be unable to rise again, losing the ability to continue the tournament. It was unknown if he would wake up in a short period of time. Under the astonished gazes of the crowd, Miss Huaishir grinned and left with her employer. The opening match of the cooking demon tournament. Huaishir Suzy victory. Even now, many of the cooking demons in the audience still hadn't recovered from the shock. Some people already had guesses in their hearts, but they would not say it out loud. On one hand, they did not have much confidence. On the other hand, they hoped that others would also suffer a loss when they met her. After all, that Miss Susie was a real strong opponent. There was no doubt about that. They could not think that Shun Jinqing was a simple character just because of his sudden defeat. After all, with the reputation of 3 roads, no one in the audience could guarantee that they would be fine after eating an entire set of Iron Cannon Feast. If they wanted to win, they had to gain the initiative by striking first. According to the rules of the tournament, the cooking demon who finished first could let the opponent eat his dish first and then try to KO. It was not like that strange woman who ate all the mutation poison without dissolving it. Moreover, she felt that it was not enough and wanted more. It could only be said that Shun Jinqing was too pitiful. He was clearly a candidate who had the potential to enter the finals, but in the end, he met the worst opponent. No matter who it was, everyone could see that the woman called Susie had an excessively high resistance to poison. Apart from that, only old cooking demon Gua had some understanding of the upgraded version of the fat otaku's sorrowful water. He was really too old. He had seen too much and experienced too much. No matter what kind of technique it was, he had experienced it from his opponent. If he guessed correctly, it should be a technique similar to the Feng Xian Dao. No, it should be a cooking method similar to the offering banquet. It originated from the cooking demon tradition in India. It was a unique cooking technique created by imitating the disaster of heavenly demons disturbing Buddha's enlightenment. It seemed simple, and the ingredients used were not that amazing. However, the method of using the origin substance was frighteningly powerful. No matter how profound a monk's meditation was, as long as a bowl of milk porridge entered his stomach, he would still be entangled by the original sinful nature of birth, old age, sickness, and death, resentment, unattainable desires, blazing een, and so on. If it weren't for the fact that the woman called White Paper Susie wasn't wearing a monk's robe during the cooking demon duel, he would have thought that she was the white lotus seed of this generation. After all, the cooking demon's signature style was to look safe and harmless. The women looked as pure as they could be, while the men looked as herbivorous as they could be. Their disguises were better than anyone else's, but their attacks were more vicious than anyone else's. Losing to such an opponent, Shun Jinqing was not aggrieved. From the beginning, he had fallen into the opponent's rhythm. Then, the flaw in his heart had been seen through, and he had been strengthened with special attacks. His complete collapse was completely within reason. As early as when White Paper Susie finished eating the Iron Cannon banquet, he had already lost half of the battle. Ho ho, the younger generation will surpass us in time. The younger generation will surpass us in time. The old cooking demon laughed with gratification, clapping his hands in encouragement. Like a benevolent senior, he praised, truly, truly terrifying. As such, he restrained the surging appetite and killing intent in his heart. He narrowed his eyes, keeping the second half of his sentence in his heart. This child, he definitely could not be left alive. Chapter 630. Late at night, in the independent courtyard of the Rakimi family manor. In the overly spacious bedroom, the darkness of the bone burial sanctuary rose, isolating the inside from the outside. Huaisher sat cross-legged on the floor, staring at the figure opposite him. They looked at each other, deep in thought. After removing the disguise left by Tongyi, he had returned to his former state and felt a long-lost, carefree feeling. At the same time, the effort he had put in these days had finally paid off. He was not referring to the crows who had eaten so much but still felt that it was not enough, but himself. And in front of him was the result he had obtained these days. The afterimage of young Master Ming. No, it was no longer an afterimage. It was more like another version of himself. It was as if there was an invisible mirror in front of him, reflecting his image in it. However, the reflections were not exactly the same. Apart from their faces being similar when placed next to each other, they were completely different in terms of gender and temperament. This was a completely different reversal. More accurately, it should be called Miss Hui Haimotoko. Thanks to Huaisher's abundant and luxurious preparations when he advanced, The bone burial sanctuary was qualitatively different from the other young Master Ming, and even the afterimage it created had considerable potential. Not only was it used to confuse the opponent's line of sight, but it also had the characteristic of being able to carry origin substance. It was because of this, under Tongyi's processing, that this special afterimage could grow to such a degree. And today, she finally transformed into Huaiheim Motoko's face, achieving a breakthrough from nothing. From this, it could be seen that Huaishi's duel on the field had a considerable impact on the entire Nara. Otherwise, the essentially illusory Miss Huaiheim Motoko would not have been able to make such progress from this urban legend. Today's afterimage, today's Huaiheim Motoko was already in existence similar to Huaishi's reflection. Now, following Huaishi's movements, Miss Huaiheim Motoko, who was opposite him, also made the same reaction. Whether it was raising her hand, stomping her foot, or turning around, everything was perfectly reflected. Even if Huaishi improvised a performance, there was no mistake in her response. After completing such a difficult move, he even winked proudly. After a long time, Huaishi finally reacted, and his hair stood on end. Because he didn't even blink just now, something was wrong. However, this kind of abnormality was normal. Huaishi felt that something was wrong with her reflection, Miss Huaishimizu. The worse it was, the better it was for Huaishi. This was one of the prerequisites he had prepared for Great Siming. She was a person of nothingness named Huaiji Suzi. A false identity, a person who didn't exist in the first place, or in other words, an existence that could replace his fate. If one were to call it a second primordial spirit or external incarnation, there would be no difference. It was just that Huaishi did not cultivate immortality, nor did he have a flying sword. If he wanted to become Great Siming, he needed a substitute. It was true that Great Siming and Young Siming came from the same source, but whether it was in the legends or now, they were two completely different existences. Even if they were sacred marks, they were level 3 and level 4 respectively. This was because to merge the two into one was not something a level 3 sublimator could do. No matter how powerful or unreasonable a level 3 sublimator was, they could not do it. It was not because they lacked the ability, but because they were limited by their own weakness. Miracles and disasters were two sides of the same coin. The other side of the sacred mark was the abyss. An excessively huge miracle would attract disasters. When Young Siming transformed into Great Siming, not only did it bring about a huge increase in power, the gravity from hell would also increase. It was impossible for a level 3 sublimator that had just completed the ether transformation to resist such a terrifying pressure. The moment the transformation was completed, Huaishi was destined to be frozen and fall into hell. In the future, he could only date the fat otakus of the Golden Dawn. Therefore, to him, there were only two ways to become Great Siming. The first was to give up his original goal of becoming a level 4 Lord of the Clouds and cultivate his abyssal army. After completing the Young Siming's destiny, he would obtain the perfect resistance to the level 4 sublimator and become a true Great Siming. This would also be considered as going through the official process, completing the transfer from the logistics department to the anti-revolutionaries department, and successfully changing his class. From then on, he would be a traitor who attacked his own people in the celestial genealogy. The second was to find a way to resist the gravity of hell, find a way to resist the erosion of the abyss, and then do it secretly. On the surface, I'm still working in the logistics department, but in reality, no one knows that I have a part-time job in the Lubyanka without a doubt. The latter would be more difficult. The existence of Lady Huaishir Suko was a preparation to deal with this problem. Since one person couldn't bear Great Siming's stigmata, 2 people would do. Although 3 or 4 people would be better, in terms of cost-effectiveness, 2 people was the easiest and most feasible way. More people would only increase the risk of losing control. Therefore, the existence of Huaishir Suko was born. If the plan went smoothly, she would be an extension of Huaishir's will when she entered the completed state. As a part of his body and soul, she would share the pressure from Great Sea Ming and the backlash from the abyss with Huai Shi. When necessary, she could be used as a substitute doll to throw all the backlash from the abyss over and cut off the connection. Since she was a tool, it did not matter even if she was frozen. Or rather, there would be more ways to play with her after she was frozen. Therefore, a tool was the most precious thing in the world. Usually, she could serve tea and water, massage his legs and feet. If something happened, she could solve it. If she could not solve it, she could even send the tool to her death. At crucial times, she could even face some curses, relic-level causality law attacks, and even a backlash from fate. No wonder so many people like to be a tool. Even Huai Shi himself was starting to have no conscience. Anyway, even if it was another him, he did not have to be polite. Under Tongyi's processing, there was a crucial qualitative change, and under Huai Shi's guidance and deduction, there was a breakthrough from nothing to something. Now, Huai Shi's Suko, who existed as a reflection, was no longer a pure imagination. But if he wanted her to improve, he had to build up enough legends. It would be best if he could create some correction value or increase some distortion. This way, as an extension of Young Si Ming, the identity of Huai Shi Suko would become more and more real. In the end, the fake would become real, and she would become Huai Shi's second body. What was even more pleasant was that her growth could also be counted as part of Young Si Ming's destiny. Huai Shi could eat 2 fish and kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Although he might lose both lives if he did not play it well, the risk was still within an acceptable range. He would just treat it as opening a smurf account. Therefore, when he was Huai Shi Suko, he had to do more things. His long-term goal was to complete the transformation of Great Si Ming and prepare to advance. Now, his short-term goal was to do as much as possible, feed the crow as much as possible, and then earn as much money as possible to feed the other crow at home. Although the former was greedy, he would be able to feed it sooner or later. But if it was the latter, he felt that there was no hope for him in this life. It's not easy to be the head of a family. Huai Shi looked up at the bright moon outside the window and sighed helplessly. In order to maintain the necessary dignity, there is no other choice but to make sacrifices. That's right. In order to prevent the present realm from being poisoned, it would be safer to use money to seal that black-hearted woman in the basement of his house. Just like that, with the satisfaction of successfully protecting the world today, Huai Shi lay on the bed and fell into a deep sleep. Then, 2 hours later, he was woken up by a phone call. Huai Shi sat up on the bed, lowered his head, and looked at the name of that stinky sister of who posed on the phone. He pressed it expressionlessly, lay down, and continued to sleep. The phone rang again. He pressed it and blacklisted it. The phone rang for the 3rd time. It was an unknown number. He helplessly picked up the phone and heard Hu Po's angry voice. "That's enough, Huai Shi. Don't be like a child, okay? Big sister, I don't know what you mean. After all, I'm only 18. Huai Shi rolled his eyes, calling and harassing a weak, helpless, and pitiful man in the middle of the night. Do you know that I can already file a sexual harassment complaint against you? Just you? Hu Po sneered. Why don't we both report each other to the Astronomy Association for sexual harassment? Let's see who the administration will believe then. Huai Shi widened his eyes and angrily rebuked with righteousness. If you have something to say, say it. Woman, don't think about those unhealthy things in your head every day. As a teacher of the people in the ivory tower, even I can't stand it anymore. 15 minutes, Xing Fu Temple. Upa was too lazy to argue with him anymore. After telling him the location, she hung up the phone. At the 16th minute, a leisurely Miss Huai Ji appeared in front of Hu upon a bicycle that she got out of nowhere. As expected, she saw an expressionless face. Why are you so serious? Come, do you have something? Huai Shi raised his hand and handed over the Odin that he bought from the convenience store. It tastes pretty good, but it's too bland. I added a little extra chili. After glaring at Huai Shi for a long time, Hupa took a deep breath and suppressed the urge to cut this stinky brother of hers with a knife. Be serious. Leave the bike here and follow me. She let out a long breath and turned around to lead the way. The murder scene is up ahead. Carrying the Odin, Huaisher passed through the cordon that was guarded outside. Finally, he saw a corpse on the road. It was too horrible to look at. The way of death looked very familiar. Huaisher squatted down and swallowed the meatball in his mouth. He studied the corpse on the ground and slowly raised his eyebrows. Decapitated. Chapter 631. In front of Huaisher was a corpse. To be exact, it was a corpse whose neck was mostly cut off. According to Huaisher's experience, the murder weapon should be a knife, and the culprit was quite skilled, like a butcher, calmly and skillfully using the simplest way to cut off the flexible muscles and hard bones, instantly breaking the neck of the deceased. The only flaw was that there was still a part of the flesh connected, which made it feel awkward. But no matter how he looked at it, it seemed deliberate. Not beheading, but correcting the mistake. Huaisher held the Odin skewers in his hand and nibbled on them, lost in thought. The more he looked at the scene, the more familiar it was. The more he looked at it, the more he felt a sense of déjà vu. Even with his unruly knowledge of tracing, Huaisher could imagine how the murderer forced the victim into the alley step by step, and then cruelly ravaged the victim, leaving wounds all over the victim's body. Finally, when despair came, the murderer coldly and skillfully cut off the victim's head. Perfect. Wait, why did it feel like he was the one who did it? This was completely his traditional program. Huaisher instantly became alert. Someone wants to harm me. But soon he calmed down. First of all, only a few people knew that he came to Yingzhou in disguise as Huaisher Su. Although Russell had a bad taste, he wouldn't kill other people just to torment him. Tongi didn't need to be mentioned. She had hundreds of thousands of ways to deal with him, so there was no need to draw legs on a snake. As for weapons similar to murder weapons, Huaisher only had the royal god sword, hatred. Not many people knew about this. His two students, the manager of the alchemy laboratory, Mr. Ping, and Raymond, who he pulled over to test the sword. They wouldn't go around talking about this kind of thing. So, the biggest suspect was, he turned around and looked at Hoopa, his eyes becoming serious. Stupid sister, what are you doing? It's not me. Hoopa rolled her eyes and lit up the 7 stars at the corner of her mouth. It's too easy for me to harm you. I just have to lift up your skirt in public. Besides, this kind of murder happened long before you came, so it's not related to you at all. Then who is it? How would I know? Hoopa shrugged and glanced outside. But that fellow has been getting more and more out of hand lately. Over there, just one more street, and that's the entrance to Nara City Hall. This is clearly a provocation. Anyway, as long as it didn't involve him. After Huaisher finished the last meatball, he threw the bamboo skewer into the container and casually tossed it into the trash can in the corner. Just like that, he finished his supper at the scene of the murder. In the end, he even took out a wet tissue to wipe his hands and mouth clean, causing Hoopo's eyes to twitch wildly. Finally, his gaze fell on the head that was still filled with fear and despair. Who was the one who died? He looks familiar. Huaisher thought for a long time, but couldn't remember. An acquaintance? For the time being, he's one of my cousins. His name is... Forget it. You're too lazy to remember anyway. Since he's dead, you can call him whatever you want. Didn't you have a cooking demon duel with his agent last night? Huaisher frowned. Shinjin Xing? He finally remembered this unlucky brother of his. He remembered that he was still sitting on a chair and watching the show. Why did he appear here? Who knows? The cooking demon left the competition, so he lost the right to compete. He probably gave up on himself and came out to get drunk. I heard that there are many places to have fun nearby. Speaking of which, while your colleagues are working hard to make a living, you're actually sleeping. Don't you feel ashamed? Sorry, not at all. Instead, I was so happy that I ate an extra bowl of supper. Huaisher retorted mercilessly. Your cheap cousin is dead. Shouldn't you be happy? Why are you so serious? Or did you call me all the way here just to share this joy with me? That's where the problem lies. Hoopa sighed faintly. An hour ago, your former colleague, Raiken's former retainer, Sasaki Kayomesa, appeared at the scene of the crime. Huaisher froze on the spot. He slowly turned his head in disbelief. What? He asked in shock. Sasaki? He didn't come meet us? We were in contact before, and he even wanted to join us. But unfortunately, When we were about to meet on the day we arrived in Nara, he stood us up and then disappeared. Hoopa sighed. Although that guy is stupid and inflexible, and his head is full of untimely and stubborn thoughts, he still values keeping his promises. I thought that something happened to him, and he might be dead, but I didn't expect it to be worse than that. But even so, I don't believe that he would become a murderer. That idiot would rather die than be in such a sorry state. Hoopa handed him the phone, and he saw the surveillance video of the intersection at that time. After a pause, she stared at the man who was hurrying in the night. There was only a back view. He was still wearing an Ingzhou-style robe, wooden clogs, and an ill-fitting long saber. On his head, he was wearing an extremely funny pink motorcycle helmet, as if he was trying to disguise himself, but it only made him more eye-catching. Only 2 short frames were shown, but it was enough to identify him. Because even if his head was covered with a helmet, that guy forgot to disguise his own sword. Whether or not he had seen it before, as long as he took the photo to the weapon craftsman to check, he could not hide his identity at all. It was too lame. Huaisher looked at the screenshot and shook his head. To be honest, I have never seen such a punk-style murderer. Hoopa was silent for a long time. He glanced at the unconscious Jinling decapitation king next to him and finally felt the thickness of the skin on both sides. He sighed. Huaisher also did not believe that Sasaki would be a headless murderer. What a joke! How could he not know Sasaki's decapitation skills? How could he be so good? Moreover, with his temper, if he really wanted to take revenge on society, he would have gone to Looming Hall with a bomb. Why would he need to do this? But it was clearly not his business, and he just ran straight into the murder scene. In fact, it was such a coincidence that he hid his tracks. No matter how he looked at it, he was a major suspect. How long has similar cases been appearing? Half a month, Hoopa said. This is also the reason why the Riken family did not announce Sasaki as the murderer now. He came here a week ago. The time does not match at all, but we can't rule out the suspicion of impersonation. It's been so long. Huaisher was stunned. The local inspector in Nara did not take action? How useless is that? Hoopa asked. In Dongxia, will the Social Security Bureau hand over the security of Jinling to the Astronomy Society? Okay, Huaisher thought for a long time and asked, is the Looming Hall in charge now? Looming Hall? At the critical juncture of the family head selection, they can't wait for the Riken family to make a fool of themselves. Everyone kicks a man who is down. At this time, everyone wants to step on him. Those guys only come to clean up the mess and pretend to apologize after they are done. Other than that, they don't care about anything else. Hoopa rolled his eyes. In order to prevent the Riken family's reputation from being damaged, the elders have decided to offer a reward to all the family head candidates. You're almost the last one to know. Got it. Huaisher understood. Whoever catches that guy will be the family head. Ah, what are you thinking? Will the Looming Hall allow it? Those guys can't do anything right, but it is too easy for them to mess things up. Hoopa sneered. They can only enter the final round and choose any border relic from the Riken family's treasury. That's it. Huaisher curled his lips in disdain. There should be a limit to lying to country people, right? Choosing any border relic from the Riken family's treasury sounded good, but in reality, by the time it was your turn to choose, the good stuff would have already been taken away. It would be like picking trash for you to choose. It would be troublesome no matter which one you chose. Plus, Huaisher did not care about ordinary border relics. The sword of virtue, the axe of fury, the spear of compassion, the sword of hatred. Not to mention Beelzebub. Even the shoulder bag he was carrying was a divine artifact. Moreover, he had a Tongla dream at home that would grant his every request. Why would he care about this? In comparison, the promise of entering the final round was more sincere. This was especially true for Huaisher. He was not a professional chef who had a bunch of recipes in his stomach. It was just a part-time job. It was okay to steal chickens occasionally, but if he really had a fight with a professional, he would be a bit scared. Being able to skip the middle process and enter the final round was undoubtedly a great opportunity for him. By then, he would just have to sit and wait for Hu Po's sister's representative to fight. Then, he would lower his head and admit defeat, and he would be able to take the money home. It was so easy and simple. But, Huaishur asked curiously, it's such a good thing, but the other candidates actually agreed? Of course, why wouldn't they agree? This is the best time to show off your strength. As long as you can prove your ability, you can obtain more important value. At the same time, it's also a chance to openly eliminate competitors. Hoopa snorted. That old man, Quan Jiang, already saw through it and found a chance to make a scene. He's not afraid of being ordered to commit seppuku after the family leader selection at all. He'll give the emperor and the general a hard time. By including solving the serial murder cases as a condition for the family leader selection, it gave all the candidates room to express themselves. From this moment on, the competition would spread outside the range of the imperial chef and demon trials. It would not be strange if a few groups of people used the excuse of investigating a murderer to walk on the streets. You said you're not a murderer, so why are you strolling on the streets in the middle of the night? Enough! Stop talking and come with me. Otherwise, I won't be polite. There were so many excuses to stir up trouble. Just thinking about it made Huaishur's teeth hurt. No, this is too troublesome. It's not within the cooking competition. After picking his feet while pretending to be Miss Paper, he slapped his knee and said loudly, I have to pay more. Chapter 632. In the end, Hoopa didn't pay. Huaishur wasn't Hoopo's agent now. Even if he caught the murderer, Hoopa wouldn't get any extra benefits. Spending money to find a tool for his cousin was still considered an alliance. If he spent money to help his cousin, then he would really be a fool. It seemed that the rich woman wasn't willing to pay. After thinking for a long time, Huaishur had to admit that Hoopa had changed. She was no longer the stinky sister who was willing to pay, but a stingy sister. It was really regrettable. After a simple search of the crime scene and finding nothing, Miss Hooper rode her bicycle, her white dress fluttering in the wind, and left gracefully. The wind blowing in his face was so cool. After a long time, the sun slowly rose. The rising sun spread its light, pushing forward inch by inch, illuminating the crime scene. In the originally empty shadow, the outline of a banner slowly appeared. Under the sunlight, it appeared for a fleeting moment, then quickly disappeared. Only the door from the dream opened for a fleeting moment. Countless mists spurted out, transforming into the shape of a flying bird. It spread its wings with a metallic glow and soared above the sky of Nara. Not long after, it blended into the local crows without any surprise. In the customs of Yingzhou, there was no custom of hunting wild crow. On the contrary, unlike in Dongxia, crow was regarded as an auspicious sign and was treated well in the city. People even fed them regularly. So, on this day, the local crows saw a group of strange guests from other places. They spoke in a strange dialect, and when they came to visit, their voices were loud and clear. Although they didn't know what Old Thai double tap 666, holy shout, meant, it was interesting. However, it seemed to be quite interesting. Many crows had already started to cry out, indicating that this slogan was much more impressive than their cawing. Seeing their powerful strength and the various gifts they gave to the local crows, such as mineral water bottle caps, expired lunchboxes from convenience stores, glass balls, and so on, countless crows in Nara quickly mobilized, warmly helping this group of friends from other places to find clues. Target, strange warrior. Target, pink helmet. Target, death. Target, abnormality. And target, local specialty yellow book. Damn, the XP of these foreign crows is so F***king weird. Why would they want this? Through the cage of dreams, Huaishur's vision was evenly focused on the flock of crows. He was constantly paying attention to the clues that the crows reported to him. Then, he coldly and mercilessly confiscated the books. If you don't learn the right things at such a young age, be careful that you won't be able to grow tall in the future. This was all to protect the mental health of the crows. They were still young and were still growing. How could they withstand this? If there's anything, just come at me, torment me, the leader of the group. However, one thing that could be considered as growth was that the crows were gradually able to communicate with Huaishur to a certain extent, apart from urging him to record every day. The increase in his intelligence level was very obvious. If it was simple work like surveillance and searching for clues, it would be no problem to leave it to them. This method of searching for a needle in a haystack was a test of manpower and endurance. If they wanted to get clues, they had to be patient. After an entire day, he confiscated quite a few books, but in reality, there wasn't much progress. He could only slowly wait. However, on the same night, the strange maid wearing a white racket mask came to inform him again. The second chef-demon duel was about to begin. The two sides of the duel were the traitor Rikimi Hupa, who had the backing of Dongsha, and her sixth uncle, the current manager of Mount Guan Energy, Rikimi Shino. Hupo's first chef-demon duel was indeed something to look forward to. What Huaishur cared more about was her substitute chef-demon, the old monster from Dongsha who is said to be over 100 years old, Guashuk. Long before Huaishur was born, this old Gua had been stirring up trouble in hell and had been famous for a long time. Although it was said that he had been viciously tricked by his own disciple, causing his energy to decline and even his sense of smell to be lost, he had actually made a comeback. This was something to look forward to. Even if his skills had greatly declined, Guashuk was still one of the few powerful opponents in the chef-demon duel. As for his opponent, it was the chef-demon of industrial cuisine, Jordan Kujijian, who came from a new cuisine that had appeared in recent years like a dark horse. According to the information provided by Hu Pa, this chef-demon who had become famous in recent years was a mixed blood from Ryukyu. He grew up in Detroit and was taught by the current representative of industrial cuisine, the 7-star chef-demon, Nitrogen Anderson. At the age of 14, he had become an official chef-demon. It could be said that he was the rising star of the new generation of chef-demons and was also a great enemy that many candidates were wary of. A veteran chef-demon who had yet to recover from his injuries and a rising star who had inherited the brand new industrial cuisine. The outcome of the duel between the two immediately caught the attention of all the contestants. By the time Huaishur and Zhenshi arrived, it was already the last round. The other candidates and chef-demons who had received the news first had already taken the best seats and were eagerly waiting. In order to maintain the distance between them, they could only sit in the last row. In fact, Huaishur had originally planned to come alone, but after learning about the situation, Zhenshi also insisted on coming. As a candidate to be the head of the family, she could not always hide behind the agent. After hesitating for a while, Huaishur still nodded. Since she was already involved, it would not be good for her to cover her eyes and act like an ostrich. At most, if they encountered a situation where she lost her mind, he would quickly cover her eyes and knock her out, so that she would not be traumatized. Miss Yi's arrival seemed to have attracted a lot of hostile gazes, which were not concealed at all. After seeing her method of knocking down Shun Jinqing with a glass of ice water, many people had already regarded her as a strong enemy in their hearts. There was even no lack of killing intent and some kind of unpleasant desire among them. Huaishur had already expected this. In the first place, he did not think about friendship first and competition second. If he really loved to work, he would not be a chef-demon. Those who could be called a chef-demon were all not good people, including Huaishur himself. No matter if it was for the sake of eating, for the sake of filling their stomachs, or for the sake of other random things. Anyone who harbored such desires and set foot in the abyss and into the depths of hell knew just how abnormal their actions were. Huaishur, who was originally a harmless machine of negative energy, could even cause a large-scale origin substance epidemic if forced into a corner. What about other people who were unscrupulous and unscrupulous? Everyone who dared to look over was met with Huaishur's gaze. His eyes, which were filled with countless negative origin substances, were like abysses that burned with flames. He did not try to hide his terrifying aura at all, coldly implanting a massive shadow into the minds of those who offended him. Countless painful curses from the Imperial Divine Blade, resentment, flashed through the air. The pure disaster tore apart the weak disguise and bared its fangs, causing the world to finally calm down. At the top of the tower, the bell finally rang out. The emissary behind the curtain stood up as usual. After saying a bunch of nonsense that no one would pay attention to, he returned to his seat. Jiang Quan's voice sounded out once again. Both sides, fair and square, will decide the victor in a single battle. The chef-demon duel had officially begun. The younger generation will surpass us in time. Behind the kitchen counter, a hunchbacked old man in a dongxiao robe raised his head. His wrinkled face was filled with a strange smile as he observed his opponent. When I was as young as you, I never had such accomplishments. I'm getting old. I'm getting old. Since you're getting old, why don't you just obediently roll into the dustbin of history? Why make people waste their energy cleaning it up? His opponent, the sturdy young man, Johnny Gu Zijian, also raised his head and glanced over. He did not try to hide his disgust at Gu Zijian's pretentious appearance. In a nutshell, this young man could be described as tough. His body was sturdy, but not burly. His muscles were well developed, but they were not exaggerated. His skin was bronze from the sun, and his joints were thick. His hands were covered in calluses, and his hair was short. He wore thick gray overalls and a white vest. That was all he was wearing. He was like a piece of metal that had been forged by a 10,000-ton press. He did not try to hide his toughness and coldness as he coldly said, "The duel has already begun. Don't waste any more time. When people get old, they like to talk. Don't embarrass them like that." Guoshuk narrowed his eyes slightly. Young people don't know the immensity of heaven and earth. They have to suffer some losses before they know how to respect their seniors. Johnny tilted his head and violently spat on the ground. After he raised his foot to wipe it away, he raised his head and sneered. "Old man, the times are improving. Do you know that? The methods of the past are no longer working. Your witch doctor methods of ranking by seniority are long outdated. The 23rd century is the era of industrialization. No, the era of humans is the era of industrialization. Absolute precision, absolute standards, and absolute output. These are the standards of victory." He raised his 5 fingers and clenched them tightly. He told him word by word, "Old man who has been abandoned by the era, obediently go back to your shack and cook porridge." That was indeed an incomparably tough style. Just by standing there, in a brief trance, it was as if there were roars and loud noises from the factory. Countless pungent dust formed a gray fog that rose from the forest of chimneys, covering the sky and covering the earth. That was a magnificent scene brought about by massive production. It was a brutal beauty inherited from the industrial world. This was indeed the essence of industrial cuisine. Even if it was just a short illusion, it could still make people understand that this man was not a nobody, but a powerhouse who came here with absolute power and skill. Anyone who dared to belittle and despise him would have to pay the price. In this regard, Guoshuk only smiled and looked at him kindly, as if he was looking at an ignorant kid. Then this old man will wait and see. Chapter 633. 10 minutes had passed. Guoshuk had not moved at all since the start of the competition. He could not even hear the sound of his breathing. It was as if the person standing there was not an old ghost whose hair and eyebrows were almost gone, but an ugly piece of rotten wood. It was placed right outside his opponent's cooking table. It was such an eyesore. He only lowered his head and focused on observing Johnny's cooking table. He scrutinized every tool and watched his every move and step. His narrowed eyes widened with curiosity and anticipation. He looked like a child who had just come to school for the first time. He felt that everything was amazing and novel. This was not bad. That was not bad. Everything was not bad. Was there anything else that was amazing? Hurry up and take it out for me to see. He had clearly expressed his admiration in such a frank manner, but it was still so unpleasant. The violent and vicious aura behind the cooking table became even more fierce. Johnny stared silently at Guoshuk. The veins on his thick arms bulged. He pressed them against the cooking table, bent down, and looked down at Guoshuk. "Old ghost, what are you looking at?" "I'm looking at you." Guoshuk answered without any embarrassment. "I'm observing my opponent and looking for your mistakes. But to be honest, your basic skills are perfect. There are no mistakes in the way you handle the ingredients. You're really amazing. Mr. Gujijian, you must have gone through countless trials and tribulations, right? I could see that every movement that didn't require any thought and skillful technique must have been obtained through countless repetitions of training. Aside from this amazing talent, your hard work and diligence are also far above mine. The fighting spirit of a young person is truly terrifying. Boom! There was a sudden explosion. On the cooking table, countless tools and ingredients suddenly flew up and then fell back down in a panic. This was because a hand covered in veins had already left a deep crack on the cooking table. Are you done talking? Johnny Gujijian raised his head and asked coldly. Yes, I'm done. Since you like to watch, then watch, old ghost. Johnny bent down and leaned closer. He grinned and said indifferently, You can play whatever tricks you want. It's fine if you destroy my ingredients and interfere with my cooking. But that won't change the result because your petty tricks won't affect me at all. He withdrew his gaze and lowered his head. Piece by piece, he threw away the ferocious turkey in his hand. He skillfully let out the blood and dissected it in an orderly manner. He wasn't afraid that the other party would secretly learn his skills. He wasn't even afraid that the other party would destroy his ingredients when he wasn't paying attention. He allowed Washuk to blabber on and on. His expression was cold. There was no trace of anger. He seemed to have become one with the concrete, steel, lime, and so on, turning into a man-made iron and stone statue. Even if the sky collapsed and the earth cracked, he would not waver in the slightest. Since the age of 8, as an illegal immigrant who was despised by other people, he had been pushing a dining cart and wandering the streets with his master. They wandered between the slums and the commercial district, avoiding the searches of the Food Administration Bureau, the pursuit of the police, the extortion of the gangs, and the exclusion of his peers. He endured and adapted in countless hostile environments, then transformed, and finally became the master. In the roaring hot steel mill, in the dusty production workshop, in the noisy and chaotic slums, next to the mosquito flying garbage dump. What was born from the roots of the deepest part of Detroit was this swift, fast, high heat, and flawless industrial cuisine. Gwashuk's tricks were not even comparable to the sound of fly to him. In just a few minutes, all the ingredients had been processed. It was time to make, without any protection. The hand pulled up the red-hot lid of the pot. The thin and pitiful temperature couldn't even penetrate the thick calluses. The moment the pot lid was lifted, a terrifying tide engulfed the entire arena. It was so pungent, so rich, and so tyrannical that the smell spread to the tip of everyone's nose, making them widen their eyes in disbelief. Was that engine oil? Huaisher took a deep breath and finally confirmed that it was indeed engine oil. Now, what was boiling and rolling in the huge pot of oil was all engine oil, but when he smelled the smell, he couldn't help but take a deep breath. He felt an indescribable sense of pleasure. Even though he knew it was so pungent and unhealthy, he couldn't help but want to breathe in more to feel this sudden stimulation and pleasure. The rough smell lingering at the tip of his nose gradually dissolved and became sweet. It was like flowers and plants, like trees, like agarwood, and in the midst of drifting, it developed a completely different smell. It was intoxicating. At the same time, it was difficult to endure the hunger and thirst. It wasn't until Huaisher reached out and forced she to sit on the chair that she realized that she had stood up at some point. She became hungry and couldn't help but want to pounce forward. She was intoxicated by the smell of engine oil and couldn't extricate herself. Her consciousness was already starting to fade. Huaisher clenched his fist, and when he opened his palm again, a small pinch of ash appeared, and he poured it directly into her nose. The ash smelled like salt and refreshed the mind. In an instant, as the pure negative origin substance spread out, Makoto's eyes became red. Tears began to flow out of her eyes as if she was recalling some painful past. She even wasted a tissue from Huaisher. After crying for a long time, she finally reacted. What's wrong with me? Miss Huaisher sighed and took out her phone to show her. Organic solvent addiction. This was a tendency that most people innately had, and even they didn't notice it. Engine oil, rosin, turpentine, paint. In the face of this volatile substance, it was obviously pungent and was not good for the body, but when one wanted to smell it, or even imagine a similar smell, a sense of hunger that only smokers could understand would emerge in one's chest. In serious cases, you would even be intoxicated by it, unable to extricate yourself. This was already an intoxicating substance, similar to tobacco or alcohol. Just the smell alone was enough to make ordinary people show symptoms of poisoning and addiction. As a culinary demon, Johnny's skills could be said to have reached the point of perfection, and it was admirable. And now, Johnny picked up a bucket of seasoning, one handful after another, and covered the prepared ingredients with a large amount of spices. He casually rubbed, and his hands burst forth with terrifying strength, like a cement mixer, kneading the spices into the raw turkey meat. "Oh!" Gwashuk raised his eyebrows. "Young man, you're not planning to use engine oil to fry it, are you?" "Can I?" Johnny grinned and mocked. "The blood of industry is engine oil, and the king of engine oil is Erickson. Today, I've prepared the signature dish of industrial cuisine, Erickson fried chicken set." Along with his movements, all the ingredients fell into the boiling pot. In an instant, a loud boiling sound burst forth, and a large amount of black smoke rose up, violently spreading in all directions. Like a chemical reaction, the chicken that submitted to the engine oil emitted a crazy, strange fragrance that blended into the pungent smell of the engine oil, forming a mist that instantly covered the entire venue. The rich smell of the fried chicken and the pungent engine oil combined into one, and when they overlapped, it exploded with 10 times the power of infection. Even Huaisher couldn't help but want to praise such a godly creation. Traces of darkness spread out from Miss Huaisher's side, vaguely enveloping Zhen Shi and isolating her. If a normal person smelled this, wouldn't they instantly become a crazy glutton like a zombie? High-fat, high-calorie food was the most basic requirement for every life form to survive. It was a desire that had been engraved in human genes, cells, and origin substances since ancient times. No matter how unhealthy it was for modern people, for those in history who were hungry all year round, it was a blessing, a two-pronged attack. The natural attraction of the high-calorie fried chicken and the magical temptation of the engine oil combined into one, forming a projection of a large city in the spreading black smoke. It was a city that was covered in smog, soot, and the rumbling of machinery. It was America's shining industrial pearl, Detroit, the shining light of industry. This place had indeed become the stage of industrial cuisine, and everything was under Johnny's control. When the golden chicken was scooped out of the oil, it shone with a golden light. In an instant, row after row of fried chicken were drained of oil powder, and wrapped in a pungent smell, they were placed on the chopping board. Chicken drumsticks, chicken wings, chicken breasts, chicken hearts, chicken fillets, chicken burgers. Johnny's movements were as quick and precise as an assembly line. Large cardboard boxes were placed one after another in a row. This was definitely not a portion that a single person could finish. "You actually made so many servings?" Gwashuk raised his head in shock, a trace of bitterness appearing on his wrinkled face. "I'm an old bag of bones, and I can't finish them all. Isn't this a little too despicable?" "Don't worry. If I wanted to feed an old thing like you, I don't need to use such a despicable method." Johnny tilted his head, lit a cigarette, and casually shook off the ash. "The workers have very bad tempers, even worse than you. They're violent, easily angered, loud, and don't know when to back down. After a day of hard work, their stomachs are rumbling with hunger. I can't let these customers wait for too long, and I can't let these workers go home disappointed. The essence of industrial cuisine is absolute output, absolute standards, and absolute satiation." As he spoke, he grinned, looked at the surrounding stages, and said provocatively, "I've made servings for 10 people today. Friends who are interested can come up on stage to collect them later, but once they cool down, they won't taste good anymore." As he spoke, Johnny picked up a large cardboard box that was even bigger than Gwashuk's head with the cigarette in his hand and placed it in front of Gwashuk. Please, old man, before you die, have a good taste of the new era's skills. Inside the cardboard box was a dazzling array of fried food, and it even came with a large bottle of iced happy water. This was enough for a family of 3 to eat for an entire day. It was an extremely large Exxon fried chicken set meal. Gwashuk picked up the cardboard box, lowered his head, and looked at the heat bombs in the box. He fell into deep thought for a long time. Are you afraid? Johnny sneered mockingly. No, I'm just curious, young man. Gwashuk reached out and grabbed a drumstick that was even bigger than his face. He moved closer and examined it. He could not help but chuckle softly. Although I'm an old thing who can't keep up with the times, at least I can still tell the difference. How is this fried chicken? He laughed loudly and exposed Johnny's pretense, causing his smile to stiffen for a moment. This is clearly tempura. That you're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.